Keith.
Good morning, milady. The first witness today is Lord Sedwill.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Could you commence your evidence, please, by providing your full name to the inquiry?
Good morning, milady. Good morning, Mr. Keith. I'm Mark Philip Sedwill, Lord Sedwill, as you've said.
Lord Sedwill, thank you for your provision of your witness statement, which is dated the 18th of August, 250229. I think it's 43 pages, and you've provided the usual declaration. I think you also provided a witness statement for Module 1 as well.
Correct.
Which we must thank you. I want to ask you first about the system by which you were provided with material to enable you to provide the witness statement. I think you were provided with a good many documents by your legal advisors and by the persons responsible for assisting the inquiry with the provision of evidence. You haven't had access to or sought to replicate all the material which you would have seen during your lengthy and impressive career to do with COVID.
No, I've had access to a range of material. I think there was something like 2 million documents that referred to the Cabinet Secretary during the COVID period. So obviously we had to try and identify the crucial ones, Cabinet minutes, emails and so on. And as you've heard, I think, Mr. Keith, in other evidence sessions, the record keeping is not, and the access to records has been troublesome.
You no longer have your mobile phone from the time when you were Cabinet Secretary and dealing with the coronavirus crisis. Is it correct that the messages that would have been on your phone at that time were not backed up? They would have been deleted? That was part of a normal policy?
That's correct. Essentially, really, as National Security Advisor, I would regularly clean my phone. I would usually, if I returned from a foreign trip in which I'd been using it where there might have been an espionage threat, it would generally be cleaned and rebooted, for example. And so I didn't have access to any WhatsApps or other messages from my end, essentially after I left office.
But you have been provided with some WhatsApp material relating to conversations to which you were party, because the record of those conversations has been retained by the other persons to whom you were speaking.
Indeed.
You didn't keep a private diary at the time, but you did, of course, as Cabinet Secretary, keep a notebook which recorded notes of formal meetings, and that, of course, would have been retained by the government.
That's correct, and I think a facsimile of some of the relevant passages has been provided to the inquiry.
Indeed. Thank you. Turning to your career and your professional background, you were you served in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for many years, from 1989 to 2013, during which time you were notably Her Majesty's Ambassador and then NATO Senior Civilian Representative in Afghanistan.
Correct.
Right. You were then Political Director of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, but you became the Permanent Secretary to the Home Office in 2013.
Correct.
And was that under the then Home Secretary, Theresa May?
That's correct. I worked for her, and then after she became Prime Minister, Amber Rudd was then Home Secretary for the remainder of my period.
But you then became National Security Advisor in 2017?
Correct.
Was that under Ms. May's administration?
Yes.
And then from June 2018, did you become Acting Cabinet Secretary?
That's correct.
When was that made permanent?
In October 2018, my predecessor, Jeremy Hayward, took medical leave in June. I was asked to step in. Tragically, he didn't recover and had to retire on medical grounds, died shortly afterwards in October, and the Prime Minister asked me to continue as Cabinet Secretary as you say, confirmed in the formal role thereafter.
Did you also become the head of the civil service, and was that combination of roles a long-standing convention?
Yes, it had been. They had been separate. I think in the 1970s, really since the mid-80s, they had been combined. There was a brief period after Lord O'Donnell stepped down as Cabinet Secretary, head of the Civil Service, and indeed Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office, when those three roles were split. And Lord Kerslake, the late Lord Kerslake, took over as head of the Civil Service for a couple of years. Jeremy Hayward, Lord Hayward, as Cabinet Secretary, and then when Lord Kerslake retired, Jeremy Hayward recombined the two roles of Cabinet Secretary and head of the Civil Service, and I succeeded him in those.
Lord Sedwill, that's very helpful. Could I just ask you to go a little bit slower,
Of course.
please? Our stenographer, who is working remotely, would find it difficult to keep up with that speed. The Cabinet Secretary is head of the Cabinet Secretariat, is, by virtue of his or her role, right at the top, at the apex of the civil service.
Correct.
Is the role of the Cabinet Secretary one that is set down in writing? Is it constitutionally defined, or is the role of the Cabinet Secretary, whoever he or she may be, rather more an organic one, something that changes over time according to who the Prime Minister of the day might be?
It is written down in the Cabinet Manual, which is essentially a codification of many of the procedures of government. The formal role is as Secretary of the Cabinet, in other words, the person who is responsible for the proceedings of Cabinet, that the minutes are properly recorded. But in practice, you're absolutely right, Mr. Keith, the role is organic, and the Cabinet Secretary balances a relationship with the Prime Minister, a relationship with Cabinet, a relationship with the permanent secretaries, and indeed a relationship with the palace. And one has to try and keep all of those relationships in balance and in good health.
As well as being head of the civil service and therefore responsible for it, and as well, is this correct, as carrying responsibility for ensuring the operations, in a general sense, of the Cabinet Office and its role in the centre of government and the role that it performs of liaising with other government departments and, to use a word we've heard a lot, synthesising the strategy, policy and operational facets of government.
That's correct. The Cabinet Office essentially, I'll simplify, is really in two groupings. There are several thousand people in the Cabinet Office. Most of that group are essentially performing the role of what one might describe as the Civil Service Department, responsible for the overall management of the civil service, central functions, HR, digital and so on. And that is overseen by the Permanent Secretary at the Cabinet Office, who in my time was first Chief Executive and then the Chief Operating Officer for the Civil Service. The direct responsibility really of the Cabinet Secretary is for the Cabinet Secretariat. Of course, as Cabinet Secretary, one oversees all of it. And that's a few hundred people essentially supporting the functions of Cabinet and of the Prime Minister.
Are two of the most important functions of the Cabinet Secretary to advise the Prime Minister on the machinery of government, how that process at the very highest level works, and secondly, to give advice on the appointment of ministers?
That's correct, Mr. Keith. Probably more the first. The Cabinet Secretary would typically provide the Prime Minister with formal advice on machinery of government, whether different departments might be reorganised because Prime Ministers will make changes to the departmental structure, cabinet committees and so on. The Prime Minister, in the end, makes the decision on a range of advice, not just from the Cabinet Secretary, about whom to appoint as ministers and so on. It would be rare for a Cabinet Secretary, for example, at the beginning of a government or in a reshuffle, to say to a Prime Minister, X should go to Y department. That isn't typically how it would be. It would be more the case the Prime Minister would have a view and would perhaps ask the Cabinet Secretary's advice or indeed check whether there were any obstacle to a particular candidate being put in a cabinet job.
Is there any convention or long-standing principle governing the confidentiality of the conversations between a Cabinet Secretary and Prime Minister over such matters?
Indeed, you put it very well. These have always been entirely private conversations. There might be other advisers of the Prime Minister in such conversations. It's fundamentally for the Prime Minister to judge. But if there were a delicate matter about, for example, the conduct or competence of of a cabinet minister, for example, that would normally be a private conversation between the Cabinet Secretary and the Prime Minister, or potentially the Deputy Cabinet Secretary responsible for propriety and ethics might be included in that as well.
Presumably that convention which governs the specific conversation between the Cabinet Secretary and Prime Minister in no way precludes civil servants, SPADs, other people talking between themselves and with others, perhaps even the press, about the merits of the appointment of particular ministers or their enforced resignation or sacking.
Indeed, Mr. Keith, it's speculation about cabinet reshuffles, etc., is the lifeblood of much commentary on government. And of course, in the end, a Prime Minister is entitled to take advice from any source, formal or informal, about whom to appoint to their cabinet.
Coming back to your performance of the dual role of National Security Advisor and Cabinet Secretary, did that give rise to any concerns on your part as to your personal capacity to be able to fulfil both demanding roles?
Naturally, there was a question of bandwidth, but that will be true of either of these jobs in any event. In either of those jobs, one is sitting at the heart of a team, and so in order to be able to perform that, I delegated even more functions than I might have done otherwise. For example, as National Security Advisor, several of the key relationships with European allies I delegated to the Prime Minister's International Affairs Advisor. And it was never intended to be a permanent arrangement. It seemed appropriate at the time. And of course, one is only replicating the span of responsibilities of the Prime Minister, who covers both sets of issues.
In his evidence to this inquiry, Mr. Cummings said that you had at one point, it's unclear when, expressed to him doubts about the wisdom of the combination of the Cabinet Secretary's job and the National Security Advisor's job. Did you express concerns to him about the wisdom of such a practice?
I don't recall it in quite those terms. Certainly, as I said a moment ago, it was not intended to be a permanent arrangement, and I was conscious that when I stepped down, it would almost certainly be the case that the jobs would be split again. It arose really because of the particular and tragic circumstances in which I'd taken over as Cabinet Secretary. I think I may well have pointed out to Mr. Cummings that my background had equipped me for being National Security Advisor, and Cabinet Secretary was not a role to which I'd ever aspired.
The split, or the re-emerged split, following your departure, may indicate, Lord Sedwill, that the combination of the two jobs was perhaps not altogether a wise one.
I think it made sense in the circumstances of the time. The government of both Theresa May and in the first phase of Boris Johnson were going through the most intense period on the Brexit negotiations. There were elements of national security involved in that. As I said, it was never intended to be a permanent arrangement. That was clear with Theresa May when she appointed me as Cabinet Secretary, and therefore it wasn't a question of whether the jobs would be split, it was a question of when.
Turning to focus a little more on the role of Cabinet, is the Cabinet the ultimate decision-making body in His Majesty's government?
Yes, correct.
But does it follow from that Cabinet must decide or take all decisions that are of significance or particular import?
It's a matter of judgment. And so there are cabinet committees which also have that authority. Collective responsibility also applies. The National Security Council, for example, is one such committee. And it's a matter of judgment for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary about which decisions should be taken at which level. So, if I may, just to give a different example, when the UK participated in military action after the use of chemical weapons in Syria in 2018 with the US and France, although that would normally have been a decision for the National Security Council, Jeremy Hayward and I concluded, for reasons which probably needn't detain us, that it was of such significance relating to parliamentary scrutiny and so on, that it should be taken by the whole Cabinet.
COVID-S and COVID-O were two cabinet committees, the institution of which you advised upon in May of 2020. Were they full cabinet committees and therefore empowered to take decisions in the same way that the full cabinet may have been?
Yes, well, in the same way that any other cabinet committee would be. In the end, as you've mentioned already, cabinet overall is the ultimate decision-making body, but formally delegates certain areas to cabinet committees, and COVID-S and COVID-O had that status.
I ask because only yesterday, in fact, evidence was given to the inquiry to the effect that in relation to the second national lockdown, ultimately the decision to impose that lockdown was taken by a meeting of COVID-O in November of 2020. Constitutionally, was that an appropriate position to be in by virtue of the fact that as a cabinet committee it was vested with the full power and authority of the cabinet to make such a decision?
That was after my time, so without knowing the full detail, constitutionally, assuming the Prime Minister and Cabinet Secretary are content, then a Cabinet Committee can take decisions on behalf of Cabinet and full collective responsibility, etc., applies. So constitutionally appropriate, of course, a matter of judgment as to whether it was the right forum.
Evidence has been given to the inquiry that throughout 2020, perhaps less so in 2021, there was a degree to which cabinet authority and cabinet governance was circumvented by virtue of important decisions being taken out with cabinet, and also, I think, a process by which the accountability of cabinet to Parliament and to the people was undermined by virtue of the attacks made on cabinet, the way in which it was described, the way in which ministers were described. Would you agree that during the latter time of your role as Cabinet Secretary, cabinet governance was undermined to a degree?
Attacks of that kind clearly undermine public confidence in cabinet governance. Actually, in terms of the formal procedures, the key decisions were taken either in cabinet or in the UK COBRA with the devolved First Ministers and their teams in attendance. So I think in terms of formal decisions, the constitutional position, we sought to follow it. And I know, Mr. Keith, you'll probably want to come back to the relationship between the dialectic within Number 10 and the formal procedures, so I won't dwell upon it
yes.
now. But I certainly sought to ensure that formal decisions were taken by ministerial groups of the appropriate nature, properly minuted, properly actioned, and I think that procedure was followed.
Is COBRA another such committee, as with COVID-S and COVID-O, in which full authority or authority is vested to make decisions of this type?
A ministerial COBRA, yes.
Yes. Not an operational COBRA?
Not an officials COBRA. Officials can, of course, take decisions that have been remitted to them on operational matters. I chaired COBRAs during various crises, but policy decisions requiring ministerial assent would be taken in a ministerially chaired COBRA.
There was nevertheless a perpetual tension between Number 10 and Cabinet, was there not, in relation to where important decision-making took place and the degree to which matters might be debated and resolved within Number 10 before being put to Cabinet?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe it as a tension between them in that Cabinet was formally involved, but as you'll have seen from some of my minutes to the Prime Minister, I did need to remind him of the importance of involving his Cabinet colleagues, not just in the formal decision, but in the formulation of that decision. It's quite normal for Prime Ministers, any minister, to talk to their own teams about a key issue before they go into a formal decision-making body. In this case, it was important just to remind the Prime Minister of the need to ensure there was space for his elected colleagues to be fully participative in those decisions.
It would seem that the formality of the process was adhered to. Why did you feel there was a need to speak to the Prime Minister about whether in substance, in practice, Cabinet was as engaged as it was required to be?
A pattern, I think Helen McNamara mentioned this in her evidence last week, a pattern had arisen really through the Brexit period, partly because of Cabinet leaks and the sensitivity of the negotiations, where in that period, ministers would go into a Cabinet meeting having not had the chance to consider papers the weekend beforehand or with their advisors, but into a reading room beforehand in order to try and understand the papers and then take their views into Cabinet. And that had clearly been unsatisfactory for many of those ministers in being able to take advice and formulate their own view. But I think that practice had, although we didn't have exactly that system during COVID, that practice of the Prime Minister going into Cabinet, particularly after the election, with a firm position of his own, and that being set out at the start, constrained the candour of Cabinet discussion.
Nevertheless, you had concerns that Cabinet was not as fully participative, to use your words, as it should have been.
Correct, and I, as you'll have seen, there are minutes from me to the Prime Minister where I remind him of the need for that.
Helen McNamara makes a second point in this context to the effect that the full Cabinet tends to be better at bringing a wider perspective, putting aside the democratic accountability, of course, vested in Cabinets by virtue of being the Cabinet of the governing majority party. Her view was that Cabinet is rather more grounded in its perspective than perhaps, I don't mean this pejoratively, a cabal of officials and civil servants, advisors, and the Prime Minister might be in Number 10. Would you agree with that suggestion?
Yes. One of the points I would remind officials of was that every minister, certainly every senior minister, was also a constituency MP. And so they had essentially a ground truth from that experience that officials sitting in departments wouldn't have themselves, that personal exposure to the public. It's one of the strengths of our system, I think. And so I was always keen to encourage Cabinet ministers to remember they weren't just speaking from their departmental perspective, but as constituency MPs with the grounding in the views of the ordinary citizen.
And particularly because this was a public health emergency with whole country societal and economic consequences, that perspective, the perspective that Cabinet could bring, was of additional value.
Indeed.
SPADs, Special Political Advisors, what are they?
How much time do we have, Mr. Keith? Special advisors, there have been special advisors, back almost, I would guess, to Lloyd George's time. But they've become, there are more of them, and they're more prevalent across government in the modern era than was the case in the past. They are essentially personal appointees of ministers. They're formally appointed by the Prime Minister, but these are people who will bring political and communications support for senior ministers. Some are, one might describe as specialist advisors. There are one or two of those in number 10 now, I believe. And certainly we had some of those at the Foreign Office in my time there. But mostly they are people with a political alignment with the Secretary of State and the government of the day, who are providing them with personal media, communications and political support.
Can I pause you there?
Of course.
Just in terms of the basics. Do they exist in both number 10 and line departments, so other government departments?
Yes, Mr. Keith. So in departments, there would normally be 2 or 3. Each Secretary of State might have 2 or 3. There are many more in number 10, and in number 10, they work in blended teams with officials and indeed experts who might be brought in. So number 10 is rather different in that sense to a line department.
Are those teams the policy and communication teams to which you make reference in your statement?
Indeed. So, for example, the policy unit would have a mixture of special advisors, specialists and officials, and that dates back to the 1970s, that kind of structure.
And are political advisors expected to restrict themselves to advising on political and communication matters, or may their brief stray across wider fields?
They're expected to bring the political and communications and media perspective to policy matters as well. So they aren't restricted in their advice. It's that they bring that perspective, and most ministers, most secretaries of state would want their special advisors in the room in a department, for example, when discussing major policy issues.
The ability to bring perspective to policy matters covers potentially a very wide area indeed. Is there any governance or any code or manual which defines the role of a political advisor, or is it very much a matter for the individual advisor and his or her minister?
There is a special advisors code, and it resembles but isn't identical to the Civil Service Code. Special advisors are formally appointed as temporary civil servants, and that's how their employment contracts, etc., work. But rather, as we were discussing earlier, there's an organic element to it, and their role will depend on the department, on their personal relationship with the minister. In number 10, their personal relationship and authority with the Prime Minister. But there are rules and boundaries set to those roles by the code and their employment.
But they are very much not civil servants, and therefore they are answerable ultimately only to the minister who appoints them, governed by or constrained by the Special Advisors Code to which they're subject.
Correct. Formally, the Prime Minister actually appoints all special advisors, even those who are attached to ministers and often move with them. So their personal affiliation is most likely to their own Secretary of State or Minister, but in formal employment terms, actually it's the Prime Minister who signs off the appointments.
Now, I want to ask you, please, about the efficiency or efficacy of Mr. Johnson's administration on the cusp of the pandemic in January and February 2020, following, of course, the general election in December the previous year. As an administration, that is to say, a body of government coming into office and able to pick up the threads of government, or the handles of government, was it a particularly experienced administration?
There were some very experienced senior ministers. Michael Gove, who was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, had served almost uninterrupted since 2010. There was a brief period when he wasn't a cabinet minister. Mr. Hancock, the Health Secretary, had been in cabinet for several years. There were others. As well. Overall, I think Helen McNamara touched on this. In a sense, it was, though, overall more like an opposition party coming into power after a general election than a government that had been in power for 10 years because of the nature of the Brexit process and the change in personalities that Mr. Johnson brought in when he became Prime Minister.
In terms of its ability to be able to focus upon and deal with an emerging crisis, and one that, of course, enveloped the entire country, how focused was that administration in the early days on its own agenda or other matters which it wished to pursue?
That was the primary focus. The general election, as you said, had taken place in December 2019. The legal deadline for Brexit was the 31st of January, and so that was the primary focus in January 2020. Because they had a majority, they needed to change some of the legislation that some of which they'd had to compromise on when it was a minority government before the general election, in order to see through Brexit. And so that was very much the focus for January. And then once that was done, the Prime Minister's focus was then on the manifesto and essentially setting a 5-year term, as he expected, off on its course with a cabinet reshuffle that didn't take place until February because of the Brexit inflection point.
And was that the reshuffle, I think, around the 14th of February?
Correct.
There has been reference, Lord Sedwill, in the evidence to your introduction of a programme called the Fusion Programme, by which you sought to change some of the mechanics underpinning the Cabinet Office, I think in relation to its secretariats in particular. When was that programme introduced by you, and what impact do you assess that it had?
We'd introduced it into the national security community from 2018 onwards, and that's where we developed it. Just very briefly, the underlying philosophy was to deal with the fact Whitehall is essentially, has very strong vertical structures between departments that can become siloed. And my strong view was and remains that the Cabinet Secretariats, whether a single secretariat or the individual components, should provide as much as possible of the horizontal connective tissue. And so that was the thought behind that programme. We developed it in the national security community, and then I was seeking to extend that concept when I became Cabinet Secretary into a unified Cabinet Secretariat. And there's a diagram, I think, Mr. Keith, we've provided, which shows the responsibilities of my key directors general. That's rather deliberately designed to look like the Olympic rings, to show there were overlaps, because I felt it was necessary to have that connective tissue in the centre to balance the very strong vertical structures of departments of state.
Were those changes to the machinery of the Cabinet Office introduced in January and February?
We'd begun some of them beforehand. It was an ongoing programme, but certainly to the broader Cabinet Secretariat, it was in its very earliest stages.
The evidence from Alex Thomas, who was the expert, I suppose, expert on governance or political science instructed by the inquiry, was to the effect that that programme created some complexity and structural confusion, certainly in its early days, by necessary virtue of the changes that you had sought to bring about. Would you agree that there was a degree of complexity and confusion brought about as a result of that programme?
Certainly complexity, and in a sense that was deliberate. Government is a complex set of organisations, and I wanted the Cabinet Secretariat to be the place that managed that complexity. Clearly, I was seeking to avoid confusion. I recognised that I was asking civil servants to operate in a different way to the way that they might have traditionally done so, operating across boundaries rather than within defined responsibilities. And that change of institutional culture and behaviour takes time.
All right. Now, turning to your first understanding of the emergence of the virus in China, your statement makes plain that this issue was raised with you by Sir Patrick Vallance on the 21st of January. I think it was the same day that the World Health Organization published its first novel coronavirus SITRAP situation report.
Correct.
Did you receive around that time a formal request from the DHSC, perhaps in the form of its Secretary of State, Mr. Hancock, for a COBRA meeting to be convened?
Yes, I don't recall whether it was a formal request, but certainly I was asked whether a COBRA could and should take place.
Did you accede to that request straight away?
Not straight away. I wanted to ensure that a COBRA, if it took place, was properly prepared. I was concerned that it might be communicated in a form that could be unnerving for public communications. At the time, the government's approach was to try and maintain calm in its public communications, and the fact of a COBRA might have disrupted that. But actually, I think 2 days later, I was advised by the head of the Civil Contingency Secretariat that there was enough of a cross-government requirement that it did make sense to go ahead, and I agreed to the request.
Did you not, in fact, doubt, to some extent, that the genuineness or the aim of the request from the DHSC for a COBRA to be convened?
There had been a practice, or a habit, I think, probably, which had stretched back several years, of COBRAs being convened for communications purposes rather than primarily to make decisions that couldn't be made elsewhere. I was confident this was a health issue. I was confident that with a very experienced team there, they had all the authority they needed in order to be able to make the substantive decisions. And I felt that a COBRA, which might have been convened primarily for communications purposes, wasn't wise. As I said, 2 days later, I was advised that there was a genuine cross-government basis for it, and I agreed.
May we be plain, please, as to what you mean by communication purposes? Were you concerned that the COBRA was being called by the DHSC for presentational purposes, that is to say, to make a splash about the role of the DHSC, perhaps its Secretary of State, and that is why you initially hesitated?
That is a fair summary of my thinking, Mr. Keith.
All right. You make plain in WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr. Hancock on the 23rd of January that you had agreed a ministerial COBRA. You used these words, "I've agreed a ministerial COBRA tomorrow." Was that decision, in fact, one for the Cabinet Secretary, or were you speaking there on behalf of the government as a whole in relation to this decision?
Formally, one would require the Prime Minister's consent, but of course there's always a shorthand in these matters, and I think the Prime Minister would have expected me to provide the advice. Mr. Hancock would have expected it to be me, so in effect the decision was mine, even though formally I guess I was speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister's authority.
The first COBRA took place on the 24th of January, and it was chaired, as we all know, by Mr. Hancock. There was then a second COBRA on the 29th of January. Could we have that, please, on the screen? 56226. We can see a number of ministers on that first page in attendance. If we go over to the second page, we can see a number of parliamentary undersecretaries of state, a number of ministers or members of devolved administration parliaments dialed in, and then a number of officials, including Chris Wormold, Chris Whitty, Sir Simon Stevens, Catherine Hammond. Many of these names are now very familiar to the inquiry. Just if we go over one further page to page 3, we can see the remainder of the officials who dialed in. There was, it would seem, no cabinet minister present at that COBRA or cabinet office official other than, I think, the director of government communications, Alex Aiken, who may or may not have been in the cabinet office or number 10. But is the secretariat to COBRA provided by the cabinet office?
Yes, Mr. Keith, if I may, I think you said no cabinet minister, whereas if you look at the first page,
Did I not say cabinet office?
I think you said you.
You're quite right, Lord Sedwill. I said no cabinet minister. I meant to say no cabinet office minister or official attended.
Indeed, so I think that is correct. The secretariat for COBRA is the Civil Contingencies Secretariat. That's part of the Cabinet Secretariat. And I know we'll be discussing that further. So they provide the secretariat for COBRA in the normal way.
And is that...
Sorry, as you see, it's minuted just as any other ministerial meeting is minuted.
And so in practice, whatever actions are taken from a COBRA meeting, whatever thinking or learning that has to be disseminated throughout government, comes to the Cabinet Office by virtue of the fact that it provides the secretariat.
Correct.
All right. If we can look, please, at page 5, paragraph 3. We can see, and we've looked at this paragraph a fair few times now, the Chief Medical Officer said that the UK planning assumptions were based on the reasonable worst-case scenario. There were 2 scenarios to be considered. The first was that the spread was confined within China. The second was that the spread was not limited to China and there would be a pandemic-like scenario with the UK impacted. Lord Sedwill, the inquiry has asked a number of witnesses about what they took from this information, and in particular, the fact that under the second scenario, there appears to be an assumption or a recognition that if the spread is not limited to China, if the virus leaks from China, then there would be, not there might be, a pandemic-like scenario with the UK impacted. So control of the virus is vital. And if it leaves China, there will be very serious problems indeed. I want, therefore, to ask you, when the Cabinet Office saw this paragraph, when it understood what the Chief Medical Officer was saying, to what extent did it appreciate at this early stage, the 29th of January, that once the virus left China, if it left China, there would be an inevitable crisis as far as the United Kingdom is concerned?
I think we wouldn't have understood that to be inevitable in the scale of the crisis that we faced a couple of months later. And that's partly because, I think this is in other documents, that this was a discussion of the reasonable worst case scenario, and in late January, early February, I think at Cabinet, for example, the Chief Medical Officer gave that around a 1 in 10 probability. And by the end of February, I think it was about 1 in 5. And so, essentially, I don't want to jump ahead too much, Mr. Keith, because I know you'll want to go through some of this, but essentially, within February, the course of February, there were 2 processes. One was in the foreground, one in the background, at least from my perspective. In the foreground were the briefings to Cabinet, etc., and I believe you may want to come back to some of those, which was essentially talking about the situation as it was, the probability that the UK would have a severe impact. And in the background, at that stage, run through the COBRA process with the Health Secretary and his team in the chair, was the planning should the reasonable worst case manifest itself. And those 2 were related, but they were distinct.
Is this the nub of it? There is a reference there to planning assumptions being based on the reasonable worst case scenario. But when the chief medical officer went on to say, essentially, in practice, in reality, there are two scenarios to be considered, it wasn't sufficiently understood that he wasn't there talking about the reasonable worst case scenario. He was talking about the reality of what would happen. Either the spread is confined or it is not. But the government thinking focused perhaps overmuch on the doctrine of reasonable worst case scenario and the probability of that occurring rather than on what the chief medical officer was saying would happen. Is that a fair summary?
I think that is a fair summary.
By early February, it became apparent that COVID was unlikely to be contained within Wuhan or Hubei province. As the Cabinet Secretary, what did you understand to be the position in relation to the availability of practical measures which could stop the spread of the virus into the United Kingdom if it were to emerge significantly from China?
I refer to this later on, and so I'm trying not to impose a false
so.
memory.
I'm asking you
what I
about
believed at the time.
the early February.
Yeah. I wouldn't suggest I had a deep understanding of what the practical measures might have been. And essentially, as I said, what I was really seeing, partly because I was dealing with many other issues, was what the briefings into Cabinet, etc., from the Chief Medical Officer, Health Secretary, and so on. And I presumed that, in parallel, in the background, if you like, the planning, operational planning, to put in place the mechanisms we'd need to tackle a reasonable worst case, should it no longer be a scenario but a fact, were happening in parallel. And certainly that was my presumption at the time. I was aware from what the Chief Medical Officer was saying of what some of those measures might be, but only in the most high-level terms.
Did you understand at that high level that the control measures, such as they were, would be effective in preventing the spread of the virus throughout the community in the United Kingdom, or that there would be very real practical difficulties with their efficacy, with whether they would work?
At the time, my understanding from the briefings we had was that it might be possible to manage the spread of the virus, but that it was inevitable, because no one had immunity, that it would spread through the population.
And that is the genesis, of course, of the mitigation herd immunity debate.
Exactly.
Come back to that. Well, that's very clear. Coming back to Cabinet, you've made the point that, of course, as Cabinet Secretary, you were necessarily guided to a very great degree by the information provided to Cabinet, to which you were the Secretary, rather than perhaps the micro level detail of COBRA. In hindsight, so I make plain in hindsight, do you think that Cabinet was given in those meetings in February a proper understanding of the seriousness of the crisis, and in particular, the realization or the information that such levels of control as might be deployed to prevent the spread of the virus were unlikely to work?
I think on the latter point, I would agree with the proposition you make, that if you look at the Cabinet minutes of that period, the first half of February, there was at a high level a good explanation of the nature of the virus to the extent the scientists understood it. Of course, it was still very new. There was an explanation about the potential level of fatalities and casualties should the reasonable worst case manifest itself, and that was based, I think, still at that stage on a flu pandemic paradigm. But there was an assurance that plans were in place to manage it. And in hindsight, it would have, as you suggest, those plans should have been interrogated more carefully by me and at the cabinet level.
There are indeed repeated references to plans to manage, and the Civil Contingency Secretariat in particular produced papers saying plans are underway to manage. We are taking steps to manage the activity. Activities are being carried out in order to plan for this eventuality. What did you understand those plans to consist of, albeit at high level? What did you think in practice was being drawn up, was being done to meet the threat of a virus which was, as was generally understood, uncontrollable once it left China?
Some of the plans I recall that I would have been aware of or was aware of. So I knew that one of the issues that had arisen from Exercise Cygnus, the flu pandemic exercise in 2016, was how to manage excess mortality. And so I was aware there were plans of that, operational plans of that kind. I presumed, but I don't think explicitly, but presumed that, for example, plans to protect, quarantine the most vulnerable, the most medically vulnerable, would have been part of that planning. But I didn't interrogate that at that time.
There was indeed, of course, in the end, a very good shielding plan drawn up, as we've heard, at pace, and
indeed,
notwithstanding considerable complexity in middle to late March. And there was obviously a plan for hand washing, and there were plans for the dealing with the numbers of deaths which might be expected under the reasonable worst case scenario. So prosaically, body bags,
yes,
how to deal with bodies. And there were also plans to deal with the legislative underpinning of whatever public order powers the government might wish to take to itself to manage the crisis. But none of those plans in any way deal with the control, stopping the virus from entering the United Kingdom and then spreading throughout the community. Was that understood or appreciated at all?
No. So the kind of capability that would have been required to do that, and I think you mentioned this in your own opening statement to this module, Mr. Keith, is the kind of capability that East Asian nations had to be able, for example, to forward and backward contact trace people coming in through the border and imposing strict border controls in order to keep incident at very low levels so that that is a practical proposition. That capability did not exist at that time. I wouldn't claim to have had enough knowledge myself to know that that was a capability that was important or indeed that it was missing. But clearly that became apparent, and it's that kind of thing that I'm referring to when I minute the Prime Minister later in the spring about the position we found ourselves in at the onset of the pandemic.
So in summary, is this fair? The capability did not exist, but there, and that of course is nothing that can, there's nothing that could be done about that, at least in the very short time span between February and the full emergence of the virus. But that capability or absence of capability was simply not the subject of extensive debate. There wasn't a debate at the highest levels of government to the effect of the virus is coming, we must have a means of stopping its spread, of controlling it significantly. But we don't have any means. What are we to do? That debate was absent.
I think the first part of that debate certainly was absent, and I wouldn't have encouraged it in the sense as you imply in your question. It would have been bolting the stable door. That capability couldn't have been constructed in the time available. There was extensive discussion about what the right strategy was for dealing with the spread of the virus, notoriously the squashing the sombrero, which I know you'll probably want to pursue in more detail. There was a lot of discussion of that.
Was there too much focus on strategy, on strategizing rather than dealing rather more prosaically with the practical implications of the emerging virus?
We should have been able to do both.
On the 29th of January, the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, emailed Professor Edmonds of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Professor Ferguson of Imperial College London with a request to model what could be done to delay the upswing of an epidemic. And Professor Edmonds says in the course of a fairly lengthy email, given the apparent speed of spread, it seems unlikely that contact tracing and isolation is going to be effective at buying us much time. There was, of course, a basic system for contact tracing, the first few hundred cases system, a system by which travellers and index cases could be tracked.
Indeed.
And the virus suppressed in those particular cases. Did you, as Cabinet Secretary, know, were you told, late January, early February, that the scientific advice was that it was unlikely that the existing system of contact tracing and isolation would buy any more than a short delay?
I don't recall in exactly those terms, although if that were contained, for example, in one of the daily situation reports, the CRIPS as they became known, then I might have glanced at it. What I did understand, I think it was at that time, was the advice that closing the borders, obviously there's more to it than that phrase, would only have a short, the effect would be only a fairly short delay in terms of the spread of the virus. I seem to recall 5 days was the number mentioned, but I wouldn't suggest, Mr. Keith, I was aware of those additional layers to that question.
And so the reality was, wasn't it, at the highest levels of government, that the fact of the absence of a capability, the absence of a practical means of control was known, but perhaps the ramifications, the consequences of that knowledge were not fully thought through.
Or not fully understood, I think.
Or not fully understood. There was a stocktake meeting between the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care on the 4th of February, which you attended. Could we have 146558? The letter from the private secretary to the Prime Minister to the DHSE deals with or sets out the issues which were debated at that meeting. The letter appears to indicate that coronavirus was only addressed by way of a short update, at which or during which the Prime Minister stressed the need to continue to explain our stance to maintain public confidence in the plan. On further travel restrictions, the Secretary of State was engaging overseas colleagues, and there was a request to keep Number 10 closely involved. By virtue of the matters under consideration, the maintenance of public confidence, what could be done about travel restrictions, and proportionality, the seriousness of the crisis by the 4th of February doesn't appear to be reflected in that debate.
I think it's the seriousness of the crisis that it became, but it wasn't apparent at that time. There'd been a cabinet meeting, I think, on the 31st of January, in which, if I remember correctly, the Chief Medical Officer, as well as the Health Secretary, had briefed. Certainly the Health Secretary did. And at that time, the advice was that the probability of the worst case, reasonable worst case, was about 10%. And so I think what you see here is a good summary of a brief discussion. The purpose of the meeting was essentially a bilateral about the manifesto plans for healthcare, as you'll see from the remainder. And the focus at that time, and I think this is reflected in the COBRA minutes around that time, was very much on travel restrictions and on essentially trying to impede the virus from reaching the United Kingdom.
following the meeting, you entered into a WhatsApp debate with Chris Wormald, the Permanent Secretary to the DHSC. Could we have 292-665? Where you debate the accuracy of a figure for the deaths that would occur under the reasonable worst-case scenario. You say this, 600,000 deaths, that's twice the number I was given yesterday. We almost ended up with stupid decisions being taken in an informal meeting. What stupid decisions are you referring to there?
I don't recall exactly. I think I genuinely don't. My concern would have been numbers moving around. 300,000 deaths is an extraordinary number, and every single one of those is an individual tragedy. So it wasn't a question in that sense that 300 was in any sense less significant than 6, but it was that if numbers kept moving around, how much confidence could we have in what we were being told? I don't recall exactly what the decision might have been.
The impression that observation gives, Lord Sedwill, is that you were concerned with decisions that you might construe as being an overreaction being taken, or that there was a decision being taken to respond to the crisis that you felt was inappropriate?
I don't know. I suspect it might have been frustration at numbers moving around and the risk, therefore, that decisions would not be taken in an orderly way if we were being told different things. I don't recall exactly what it might have been. I wouldn't. Sorry, I need to slow down. I wouldn't have expected a substantive decision about managing the virus to be different on the basis of whether it was 300,000 or 600,000 in the reasonable worst case. It would have been more a question of knowing, frankly, whether we had any confidence about what we were being told.
May I press you on this,
Please.
Lord Sedwill? You yourself draw a clear distinction between the substantive decision-making process, which you describe as stupid decisions being taken, and the issue about the correctness of the figures themselves. So the reference to decisions on the face of this communication is not a reference to the validity of the figures. It is to do with the decisions that may be taken as a result of the figures which the government was being provided with.
It's possible, Mr. Keith, this is a very brief WhatsApp exchange where I'm clearly expressing some frustration. I genuinely have no recollection of what the decisions might have been. So these might have been significant decisions. They might have been insignificant decisions. I simply don't know.
In relation to the figures, the reasonable worst case scenario under the government's own national security risk assessment process, with which, of course, as the National Security Advisor, you were extremely familiar, was 820,000 deaths. That was the reasonable worst case scenario for the worst type of flu pandemic.
Correct.
So why, given that fact, and given that the government was aware that the infection fatality rate of coronavirus was likely to be around 1%, and that the majority of the population would be infected, were you so sceptical concerning Mr. Cummings's assertion that the reasonable worst-case scenario for the number of deaths was higher than that which you had yourself presumed it to be?
I would have been sceptical at almost any random piece of information entering into a meeting that I hadn't seen properly analysed. So as I said, I don't think that any significant decision would have been different, whether the number were 300, 600 or the 820 to which you refer, because all of them require extraordinary measures. As I said, I genuinely can't remember the basis for this, but looking at that and knowing the kind of conversation I might have had with Chris Wormold, I would have been worried that a sudden change of number would have triggered an ill-considered decision.
As it happened, and as of course the government knew, the infection fatality rate was around 1%. With the population of the United Kingdom being what it is, the absence of control, community spread, and assuming that between 50 to 80% of the population become infected, 1% of that infected part of the population is indeed in the ballpark of the figures that Mr. Cummings was referring to. So why, was there a basis? What was the mathematical basis for questioning his approach? Did you sit down and work out what the figures might be based on the infection fatality rate and the infection rate?
No, as the first message says, that's twice the number I was given yesterday. So presumably someone doing all of that analysis would have given me the number of 300. And as you see in the response, the chief medical officer, according to the response, thought the reasonable worst case was 1 to 300,000. And I wouldn't have felt qualified to make a simple arithmetic comparison, because a lot, of course, would have depended on, I know we'll come back to this, which cohort of the population was infected by the virus and whether it was possible to protect, quarantine and protect those most at risk.
Yes,
but that would have
this,
been
of course, is a reasonable worst-case scenario based upon population figures as well.
Yeah. But certainly that was clearly from this, that was a number I was given, presumably from the experts.
On the 5th of February, the next day, there was a Cobra, 56215. There were a number of ministers in attendance, and there were a number of officials from number 10. If we go over the page, I think we can see 2 officials from number 10, Imran Shafi and Sir Ed Lister, as he then was.
Yep.
Page 5, paragraph 2. Provides the update given by the Chief Medical Officer. On average, individuals who had died as a result of the novel coronavirus had spent between 7 to 10 days in hospital before dying. The 2 most high-risk groups appeared to be the elderly and those with pre-existing illnesses. And then this, the 4th bullet point, the fatality rate estimate remained at 2 to 3%. So in fact, quite high, although it doesn't say whether that is the infection fatality rate or the case fatality rate. And they're different because it depends on whether you're drawing a ratio against the population as a whole or just those persons who happen already to be infected. This COBRA meeting, again, is notable for the absence of any sophisticated debate about the absence of control mechanisms to stop the spread of the virus from the United Kingdom once it leaves China. You would say, presumably, that level of information was simply not provided by the experts who were providing the information to COBRA.
I don't know. I think the experts would have provided quite extensive information. These COBRAs tended to have quite an extensive pack as part of the reading for them, the CRIP, the situation update, etc., and that would contain the latest SAGE advice and analysis. I recall those were quite extensive documents, and I think some of them have been referenced by the inquiry. So my presumption is not that the information was there, but that the focus of the COBRA was on the immediate measures to be taken. And at that stage, in early February, it was still very much on travel.
At a cabinet meeting on the 6th of February, 56137, the Prime Minister cautioned against the economic damage that would be caused by political overreaction to the crisis. We can see the attendees on the first page.
Yep.
Summing up, I'm afraid I can't recall which page it is on. The Prime Minister said that confidence was contagious as well as a virus, and it was important the government remain measured in its response. There we go. Thank you very much. The Prime Minister said that confidence was also contagious and it was important the government remain measured in its response. The Secretary of State for Health and Social Care had taken the right tone. Often the significant economic damage of a crisis came from political overreaction rather than the problem itself. This had been true of bovine spongiform encephalitis. The tenor of that cabinet meeting, therefore, Lord Sedwill, appears to have been, it's all right, we mustn't overreact, play it cautious, we mustn't damage confidence and we mustn't cause economic damage, rather than focusing on the seriousness of the virus itself.
Well, you see how the Prime Minister summed that up following a cabinet discussion. I think, again, this goes to the point I made earlier. I'm just trying to explain it, really, is this foreground, background point that if you look earlier in that cabinet minute, it is still the case that the scientific advice is essentially suggesting that the worst case scenario is unlikely, is indeed very unlikely. And so that undoubtedly will have informed the way ministers were thinking about this. And the Prime Minister, in that summary, is trying to balance the tensions.
Ladies, that's a...
Before you do, you say that the members of the Cabinet were focusing on the worst case, but if the worst case is 800,000 deaths, a bad case, which isn't the worst case, could be 500,000 deaths. So I'm not understanding why there's this focus always on the reasonable worst case scenario. How about a fairly predictable scenario?
Well, I think that is right.
Lots of people will sadly die.
I think that's right, milady, and I think there is a question here about, I think as Mr. Keith touched on earlier, about whether focusing on reasonable worst case skews the analysis and discussion. One of the things we tried to do in the national security arena was to look at a range of scenarios. You can't do too many because it becomes unmanageable, but we look at reasonable worst case, essentially a best case, and then a sort of a minimum acceptable, if you like, in order to do that. And I think we do need to look at the way that we address some of these kind of crises. I don't think Cabinet, the point I was making, my lady, was not that Cabinet was focused on the reasonable worst case. The COBRA process clearly was, and in terms of the measures that might need to be taken, Cabinet was essentially being briefed not on a scenario, but on what the situation was at that time and the probability that something like the reasonable worst case was still very unlikely. As you say, had that briefing suggested that the probability of a quarter of the number of casualties was significantly higher, I think that would have changed the way that ministers would have thought about it.
But no one put to the ministers, don't think about the reasonable worst case scenario. Think about, ask me, if I'm the advisor, say, what is the probability of this virus coming to the UK and causing an awful lot of unnecessary deaths? Isn't that the probability factor one should be looking at, not the reasonable worst case scenario probability?
Exactly, you put it very well. I think I think we're making the same point that there was too much focus, including in the briefings to Cabinet, on the reasonable worst case, rather than from the deep experts, here's what I think will happen.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the same dichotomy, isn't it? Reflected in that briefing in the second COBRA from the Chief Medical Officer. He says, this is the reasonable worst case scenario. However, in reality, the real scenarios are the following. And that dividing line blurred throughout the course of this time.
Indeed, Mr. Keith, and if you look at, it was set out in that meeting, but not in those terms in some of the cabinet and other meetings of that ilk.
Thank you very much. We'll break now. I hope you're warned that we take regular breaks.
Indeed.
I shall return at 11:30. Mr. Keith.
Lord Sedwill, the inquiry has received evidence that between the 14th of February and the 24th of February, the Prime Minister was, for part of that time, in Chevening and returned to Downing Street on 2 or 3 occasions. He continued to receive boxes, notes, and the like, but that there were no emails or notes relating to coronavirus provided to him during that time, that 10-day period. There were certainly no COBRAs convened to deal with coronavirus. There was no cabinet meeting and no strategy meeting. Were you conscious at that time of the drop in the tempo of government relating to the coronavirus crisis?
Not the absence of COBRA meetings, for example. I would have expected that to continue. That would have been a parliamentary recess. It would have been natural for other business, as you say, the tempo to drop, but I would have expected the work to continue.
It does rather appear as if the rate of work dropped. There don't appear to have been many strategy papers produced in that time, if any notes from the Civil Contingency Secretariat. SAGE continued, but there doesn't appear at the higher level of government to have been much by way of a throughput of work on coronavirus for those 10 days. That's rather regrettable.
I would have expected it to continue, yes.
On the 28th of February, the Civil Contingency Secretariat produced a paper, 182331. It's a paper to the Prime Minister from the head of the Civil Contingency Secretariat, Catherine Hammond. In paragraph 1, she said, COVID-19 looks increasingly likely to become a global pandemic, although this is not yet certain. Certainty of a global pandemic was not really the threshold, though, was it?
No, I presume that reflected the expert advice she was receiving.
The approach in the United Kingdom is currently to contain the small number of cases here and reassure the public. The approach may have been that, but the practical means to do so were, as you have agreed, absent, were they not?
The kind of measures that were available to East Asian countries, as we've discussed, were not available. I think so. This was essentially reflecting the overall approach, as you see the underlinings there of contain, delay, mitigate. So I presume she's reflecting there the overall, what one might call the overall contain framework for that phase of dealing with a pandemic.
There is there not, an acceptance that the virus cannot be stopped from entering the United Kingdom, that it will spread, and that all that can be done is to delay the onset of the peak and mitigate the worst aspects of it?
Indeed.
And in paragraph 6, and this goes back to my lady's point concerning the reasonable worst case scenario debate, quite detailed information is given about what the reasonable worst case scenario is. And the detail of that information makes absolutely plain that whilst it is still described as the reasonable worst case scenario, this is what is going to happen.
I don't think it was completely clear that this was what was going to happen at that point. I think at the same time, I I think it is in one of the two witness statements. There's a conversation between the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Health Secretary, which still says the probability of the reasonable worst case is about 1 in 5. But to go to the point you've made, and Milady made just before the break, I think one of the lessons of this is that we shouldn't be over-focused on reasonable worst case. We should be focused on the range of cases and the likelihood of impact.
But it's more stark than that, Lord Sedwill. If the author of this report is recognising that all that can be done is that the peak will be delayed and the worst part, the worst aspects, the worst impact of the pandemic mitigated, then there is there not, a recognition that large parts of the population will indeed be infected and a huge number of people will die?
The first part is clearly true, and that reflected the scientific advice at the time. No one had immunity. There was, therefore, as I think I mentioned earlier, a presumption that it would spread through the population and, as this says, infect 80%. Whether the number of deaths, of course, would depend on how we managed it. And that brings us to questions around alternative strategies to lockdowns and so on, because what was also clear by this point was the differential impact on different cohorts. We touched on that earlier, but I think, if I remember rightly, for example, the mortality among those infected who were over 80 was 8% or more. The mortality among children infected was still at 0%. That doesn't mean zero, but 0%. And so the numbers that might die would depend on the policy response.
But the whole point behind the mitigation strategy was to squash the sombrero, to squash the peak, to delay the peak, to level it off. Whichever way you cut it, there were going to be vast numbers of dead. That was what the scientific advice told us. And the question about flattening out the peak was partly about seeking to push that into the summer months when the virus would be, the advice was the virus would be less deadly, and to ensure that those who had a serious case could be managed. The NHS had the capacity to manage those who had a serious case, and thus minimise the number of deaths through treatment, etc. The fatal sombrero would still be there. It would only be squashed. Indeed,
Mr. Keith, the scientific advice was as we've I think both said, that not that the virus could be stopped, but that its spread and serious incidents could only be managed.
That therefore being the case, Lord Sedwill, why at this date on the 28th of February were not levels of alarm raised higher than they were?
They should have been.
Right. Was it, as some witnesses have suggested, just that elements of the government just believed it wasn't going to happen, that there was optimism bias?
That is a fair point. I think it's hard looking back to recall quite how extraordinary were the measures we later took. They were unconscionable at the time. And therefore, I think your point about this instinctive human reaction is true. I think it's also the case. Sorry, I'm probably going too fast. I apologise. I keep trying to remember to slow down. I think it was also the case at the end of February, the number of cases in the UK was, on the data available, still very small. I think 19 on the 28th, although I believe it was actually about 4 times that, but at the time they believed that. And so one can understand how non-experts, not familiar with exponential movement might have misunderstood the pace at which the disease was moving.
Did you speak to the Prime Minister directly in the first week of March about the necessary level of alarm that was required to be raised, about how serious this problem was?
I don't recall any specific discussion, but there were meetings in the first week of March. I was certainly in those meetings with the Prime Minister, and so we would have discussed all of that. I couldn't tell you exactly what comment I might have made. I would normally leave that to Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor to set that out, but I might well have done so.
In terms of his general response, evidence has been received by the inquiry to the effect that he said, or he expressed the view that he didn't think it was a big deal. He wasn't sure anything could be done. It might be like swine flu. Regardless of the individual words purportedly used, what was the general tenor of his reaction?
I think that he's an optimistic person. I think that optimism bias you mentioned a moment ago probably did reflect his overall stance at that point.
On the 3rd of March, the government published its sole action plan for the handling of COVID, called the COVID Action Plan 182380. We know from paragraph 3.9, the page for which I regret to say I can't recall, that it provided for a series of steps or stages: contain, delay, mitigate. Helen McNamara, in her witness statement, says, in retrospect, this is an extraordinary document, given that so many of the assertions about how well prepared we were would turn out to be wrong only weeks later. Would you agree?
Yes.
Would you also agree that by the date of the 3rd of March, control had, in reality, already been lost?
We didn't understand that at the time, but and indeed that wasn't the advice I think Sage gave us at the time. But given what we discovered only 10 days, less than 10 days later, then the disease must have been moving faster and was more widespread than we knew at that time. Yes.
SPIMO had, on the day before, the 2nd of March, formally confirmed that there was sustained community transmission in the United Kingdom. So it was known. Why wasn't the government aware when it published this document that control had been lost by virtue of the sustained community transmission?
That message can't have been communicated through the system properly to the top of government.
Evidence has been given also to the inquiry that around this time, the Cabinet Office and Number 10 in particular tried to ascertain what there was by way of planning from line departments, from other government departments. And the emails sent from Mr. Cummings and from text messages that, or WhatsApp messages he sent, it's clear that the Civil Contingency Secretariat had not been able to, firstly, provide a central plan, other than this action document, or been able to obtain plans from the other line departments and provide them to Number 10. That was a serious error, or serious flaw, was it not?
The CCS, the Secretariat, wasn't resourced to hold all of these plans across many departments. The governing concept was of lead government departments who were responsible not only for their own plans but for ensuring that other departments who would be supporting them on a risk area for which they were responsible had plans in place. The fact that CCS were asking for plans and they were not being received was clearly an indication, as Helen McNamara set out, that the operational plans sitting behind this published plan were not in the right shape.
Line departments had plans for their own internal governance, how their own departments should be reorganised or recalibrated to deal with those parts of government which, in the face of the crisis, would need to be managed. But there were no central overall plans held by the Cabinet Office or Number 10 or anywhere else saying, this is what we need to do, this is what we should do to address this emerging crisis.
No, that's correct. Departments would be required to have two sets of plans. And my letter to heads of department is essentially a reminder to them, a few days later, is a reminder to them of that. First is their own business continuity plans, managing their own operations, ensuring they can still provide the public services for which they're responsible, notwithstanding the impact of the crisis. So being able to operate with 20% staff absences, etc. But they're also required to have plans for their sectors. And that, of course, those aren't operational in quite the same way, but in support of the lead department, which is required to hold the overall plan.
The DHSC had no plans sectorally for those areas of the country and those areas of government for which it was responsible. And the Cabinet Office had no plans or documents which coordinated the plans from the line departments, brought them together or refined them. Did they?
No, and that is one of the lessons, I think, of this period of the crisis.
Can you just explain more, Mr. Keith, what you mean by no plans sectorally?
Lord Sedwill, you'll do it far better than I. Is this the position that a department might, for example, say, well, in a crisis, we need to have a plan for how we recalibrate our staff, our working arrangements, how we set up a crisis response machinery inside our own department, and this is how we, the department, operate. But it is also responsible sectorally for, in the case of the DHSC, the NHS or the care sector. There is an additional responsibility to draw up plans across the wider parts of government in those areas sectorally for which that department is responsible.
Correct, Mr. Keith. And I think your example of the social care sector is particularly pertinent because of the fragmented nature of that sector. DHSC had oversight of it, but no direct control. And it's provided through a mixture of public and private, national, local, third sector, etc. So a complex sector. I suspect we may come back to this point. But the contingency planning should have covered that sector, even though it wasn't directly within the department's responsibility. Department for Work of Pensions, to take a different example, would have a plan for continuing to be able to pay benefits.
In terms of the civil contingencies obligations upon this government, upon that government, the complete absence of whole government plans dealing with the various parts of the country that would be impacted by this virus was a very serious flaw indeed, was it not?
Indeed, and when we realised that about a week later, as you've said already, Mr. Keith, we had to take extraordinary action to ensure that plans and programmes of that kind were put in place and at speed.
In an email dated the 5th of March, 285-989, page 1 and then 2, Mark Sweeney, who was a Director General in the Cabinet Office, says at A, I think Secretariat role here beyond CCS has three aspects: making sure that the various social, domestic and economic policy decisions flowing from COVID are prepped and taken in a sensible way. So Mr. Sweeney appears to be saying, basically, there are a large number of extremely complex moving parts to this crisis, and there has to be some way of preparing for bringing them together and enabling the decision makers to draw the threads together to make the best possible decisions. If we then go down to page 2, we can see that Mr. Sweeney says in the last line of that email, privately, Mark has called this meeting because he's concerned about A. Are you Mark?
Yes.
What was your concern about the absence of a proper means by which these various threads could be drawn together for the benefit of the decision makers?
I was conscious by that point that, and perhaps I think almost certainly should have been earlier, that the CCS and Cobra machinery couldn't bear the weight of a whole of government effort that this now required, and therefore wanted the whole Cabinet Secretariat essentially to, putting it bluntly, drop everything or drop nearly everything else and get onto this. And so that's why I would have called that meeting, and I think that's what Mark Sweeney is referring to.
The CCS and Cobra are, of course, within the Cabinet Office.
Indeed, they're part of the Secretariat, but there's a lot else too.
Their failings were failings of the Cabinet Office, were they not?
I wouldn't describe their failures. They did not have the capability and capacity to do what by then was required, and of course, that's part of the Cabinet Office and its overall response. I accept that.
Their very function was to be able to respond effectively, speedily, to whatever crisis might befall the nation. They are the government's primary crisis machinery elements. They could not cope with the crisis that they were confronted with.
They could not cope with a crisis that of this scale by that point. This was a once-in-a-century event. They were essentially designed, as I think you've heard from other witnesses, to deal with more limited, more time-bound crises, whether those were national security issues or floods, etc. And by this stage, it was clear that this was of a wholly different magnitude and beyond CCS's capacity and capability.
You know, and you were, of course, the National Security Advisor, that the Tier 1 risk in the government's own national security risk assessment process is a serious pandemic causing a reasonable worst-case scenario of 820,000 deaths. They knew that the most important, the most serious risk of all was this risk. Why were they not ready?
They didn't have the capacity to deal with this on their own at this scale. And so if I think about other issues that CCS have dealt with, it is normal that they will support the government through the initial phase of a crisis. For example, the Grenfell fire, much more limited issue. That was dealt with in Cobra by CCS, but the response was then handed over to the Department for Communities and Local Government as the lead department for issues of that kind fairly swiftly. A crisis of this scale, one would expect the same to happen because CCS need to retain capacity in case there's a concurrent crisis. So it isn't the case that CCS would be expected to run this all the way through. One would normally expect it to move to a lead department. And of course, Cobra was chaired by the lead Secretary of State. By this stage, it became clear, and should have become clear to me, as well as others earlier, and in the end, this is my responsibility, that we needed to reinforce the machinery at the centre of government in order to deal with a crisis of this scale and speed.
Lord Sedwill, with respect, it wasn't an issue of the CCS and Cobra not being able to run the whole crisis or run it all the way through. In the beginning stages of the crisis, the machinery of government dealing with crises was unable to cope with the very Tier 1 risk which it had been enjoined for years to be able to address. It had no real whole government plans. It failed to understand that there was an absence of control, that the virus would inevitably come, and there were no practical means of stopping it. None of those issues were addressed by the very crisis machinery designed to address them.
The crisis machinery would not have realised at the time, the people involved would not have realised that at that time. And I think, I don't know whether you want to come on to this, I think you may want to come on to lessons learned later, but I would draw some of those, I'd draw some other lessons as well about preparedness going into this crisis and capability going into this crisis, which certainly I, and I don't think the government as a whole, didn't appreciate at the time.
On the 13th of March, you submitted advice to the Prime Minister recommending changes to the machinery of government. Was that the advice which recommended the institution of meetings daily at 9:15, and also the setting up of what we've heard of the ministerial implementation groups, the 4 groups dealing with health, general public services, economic and business response, and international?
Yes.
There is an email between, I think, yourself and Mr. Liddington, the Deputy Principal Private Secretary, to you, 285996, page 2. We can see there an email from Mr. Cummings saying, we need 8:15 number 10 meeting in cab room, in the Cabinet Office room, chaired by me or Lee Kane. And then he goes on to say that morning's meeting had involved a lot of people baffled about policy and unable to make decisions or even knowing who's in charge of key policy areas. You respond to this suggestion from Mr. Cummings as to who's going to chair this meeting on page 1. Mark Sedwill, middle of the page. OK, fine for Mark S. That must be Mark Sweeney.
Indeed.
Etc. to go, but we're not running a dictatorship here, and the PM is not taking nationally significant decisions with a bunch of number 10 spads and no ministers, no operational experts and no scientists. If necessary, I will take over the 8:15 slot and chair a daily meeting myself. Might your concern have been generated more by issues of process and form rather than substance? Mr. Cummings was plainly concerned that there needed to be a properly run, properly managed and effective meeting to get on top of this terrible crisis.
No, it wasn't about process. It was about making sure that decisions taken were taken with the right input. And as you see here, I'd completely forgotten I'd written this email, Mr. Keith, but it expresses pretty pungently, I accept, my view about collective government.
Was it in your mind when you recommended this change of machinery of government to the Prime Minister that the devolved administrations could play a proper role in the crisis response and engage with the United Kingdom government at these meetings, or at least part or some of these meetings?
That was very important to me. One of the things I'd made a priority as Cabinet Secretary was strong relationships, both institutional and personal, with the devolved administrations. I'd spent time with each of their first ministers, always told them I was their Cabinet Secretary as well. They should think of me as supporting them as well. And so I did want to ensure that the MIGs, for example, contained the devolved administrations, recognising that different decisions were taken in different jurisdictions, but clearly the more collaboration and coordination, the better.
And so the inquiry may understand the position correctly. The devolved administrations were invited to attend the ministerial implementation groups. Was that a right or was that an invitation?
It would be an invitation. Cabinet committees do not normally involve devolved administrations for obvious reasons. They weren't included routinely in the international one because that's an entirely reserved matter, but they were asked to join the others. And the expectation was that they were included. It wasn't just they would be invited ad hoc. They were part of that process. That was very much the intention.
And after the 13th of March, COBRA still continued to convene, did it not? Therefore, may we presume that the devolved administrations continue to attend COBRA whenever it's at thereafter?
Indeed. That by then, COBRA was taking place, was being hosted from the Cabinet room usually on Zoom or Teams. and the devolved administrations would routinely be there. And in fact, although the shorthand we've used for it is COBRA. Actually, if you look at the minutes of it, we called it the C19 ministerial. I think we'd essentially created the cabinet committee structure around it.
And was there also a third process by which the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster would meet with members of the devolved administrations periodically?
Yes, it was one of his ministerial responsibilities, and he'd also developed political relationships with the devolved administrations, and so that was something he took on.
Your statement recognises that there were occasional frictions in the relationship between the United Kingdom government and the devolved administrations, due firstly to the structures and styles of governance within the United Kingdom, and secondly, what you describe as the differing perspectives of the individual devolved administrations. What is the inquiry to make of that degree of tension? Ultimately, did the United Kingdom and the devolved administration speak from a relatively uniform position? Were they broadly in alignment? How much did that degree of tension or friction matter ultimately?
I think in that phase of the crisis, the alignment was striking. It became paradoxically more difficult later when the difficulty of the decisions was considerably less acute than it was at that phase going into the first lockdown. And the point I was making was these were rival political parties. A Conservative government in London, a Labour administration in Cardiff, Scottish nationalists in Edinburgh, and of course a coalition in Northern Ireland with very different perspectives and as I knew from my own experience with them, very different personal governance styles by the First Ministers. So actually I think in that phase of it, the alignment and willingness to align was striking. It became higher friction later.
There were obviously a wide range of decisions that the United Kingdom government had to take, ranging from, as it transpired, the decision to impose the first national lockdown, but also in the week beforehand, a decision about the closure of schools, the social restrictions short of a lockdown, and there were also issues about public communications. The evidence appears to indicate that there were particular frictions revolving around public communications, because of course the United Kingdom Prime Minister, when he addresses the nation, is bound to have an impact on all parts of the nation. And secondly, there was an issue about the closure of schools, because of course schooling is a devolved matter. But in relation to the heart of the decision making that the government had to engage in, the lockdown decision, was there any significant or any degree of divergence?
I don't recall any degree of divergence. I think the points you make about communications and schools are correct. And it's worth just recalling that we didn't call it lockdown at that time. What we've now come to know as lockdown essentially came in two tranches. One on the 16th of March, which was largely voluntary and advisory about isolation, social distancing, working from home, and then subsequently the full stay-at-home message, which we then came to know as lockdown about a week later. And the devolved administrations and government in London essentially all moved in lockstep through those two decisions.
The inquiry is aware that, of course, the 23rd of March decision was a decision requesting the country to stay at home, but it was, of course, one that was backed by force of law.
Indeed.
That is why it's the lockdown decision.
Yeah, exactly. All I'm saying, Mr. Keith, is we didn't. I don't think at the time, if you look at the papers at the time, we didn't use the word lockdown really until afterwards, when all of these had come together.
Indeed, you did not. Without going into the detail of the change in strategy, the evidence shows that there was emerging understanding that the mitigation strategy would lead to the NHS being overwhelmed, and an emerging understanding that the squashing of the sombrero, the levelling off of the highest part of the peak, an attempt to delay the peak, would lead the country into the abyss, and it was necessary to apply much harsher, more stringent suppression measures to really get on top of the virus and to control it. Would it be fair to say that you were concerned about the change in strategy?
Yes, I didn't see it at the time as a switch, as we've heard, from plan A to plan B. That Sage had essentially said a week or so before, I think, that certain measures, those taken on the 16th of March, would be necessary. Their own data coming up through the formal system said in that first week of March that the disease was wider spread and accelerating faster than they believed. And so through that process, there was essentially what I understood to be the case was, as I apologies if I haven't quite remembered the word you used, but essentially an acceleration and intensification of the measures to stamp down harder on the progression of the disease to keep serious incidents within the NHS's capacity to cope. In parallel, the team in number 10 reached the same conclusion and essentially took the Prime Minister through to that, but the formal decisions were taken on the basis of the SAGE evidence, etc., in a UK COBRA, I think, on the evening of the 15th of March.
But there was a change, was there not? There was an understanding that herd immunity, which was a necessary part of a mitigation strategy, could not, would not work because it failed to apply the necessary degree of control.
By that stage, clearly, because the disease was so much more widespread through the population, the question of alternative approaches, whether the suppression and control that we've talked about or a segmentation approach were no longer practicable, even if they had been. And so therefore that was the only option available.
So there was a change?
There was a change. As I say, I understood it at the time as an acceleration and intensification of measures that SAGE had already alerted us would be necessary, rather than a switch from plan A to plan B. But there was, yes, there was of course a change. It's whether it was a complete change or as I say, an acceleration, etc.
Was it in the context of that change, Lord Sedwill, that you made your reference to chickenpox parties, which, out of fairness, I must ask you about,
Of course.
because you've heard the evidence about it. It's important that you have the opportunity of saying whatever you want to say about the context in which that remark was made.
Well, that remark was made before the meetings of the 13th to the 16th of March and the change of approach. And I should say, at no point did I believe that coronavirus was only of the same seriousness of chickenpox. I knew it was a much more serious disease. That was not the point I was trying to make. And as soon as I realised, I think from Ben Warner's reaction, that that's what he thought I was suggesting, I dropped it because I realised the analogy was causing confusion.
Were you seeking to make a different point, which is that were people to be allowed to become infected with chickenpox, that they would therefore be allowing themselves to become vulnerable to a virus, and that particular virus, and in the context of coronavirus, if the policy being pursued was one of herd immunity, whereby putting aside those people who were necessarily shielded or segmented, the remainder of the population would necessarily be infected, that was simply a recognition of the reality of that strategy.
That's a fair summary, Mr. Keith. I was essentially trying to address this question we've touched on several times, which was the judgment that it was inevitable that the virus would spread through the population. And what I was trying to examine was there a way of managing that, given its highly differential impact, that ensured that it spread through those for whom the disease was likely to be unpleasant rather than dangerous, and that we could quarantine and shield those for whom it would be dangerous. If I may, though, there's a point might just make to the families. These were private exchanges, and I certainly had not expected this to become public. And I understand how, and in particular, the interpretation that's been put on it, that it must have come across that someone in my role was both sort of heartless and thoughtless about this, and I genuinely am neither. But I do understand the distress that must have caused, and I apologise for that, because it certainly wouldn't have been my intention, and of course I wasn't the one who made it public.
During this change, as I've suggested to you, or acceleration, as I think you would prefer to put it, there were two particular WhatsApp messages sent by Mr. Cummings to Mr. Johnson. We won't put them up, but they're dated the 12th and the 14th of March. You know which ones they are, in which they debate and appear to agree that the Cabinet Office and you personally were off the pace. The context in which those emails arise is plainly a debate about whether or not you personally had understood the seriousness of the crisis. So against the context, against the background, or in the context or against the background that there was an acceleration of understanding or a change in strategy, however you put it, might it have been the position, Lord Sedwill, that you were slower to appreciate the seriousness, the terrible predicament that the country was in than some others in Downing Street and the Cabinet Office?
It is possible. It is also possible that I might have created that impression. I think the WhatsApps you refer to came after a telephone call I had with the Prime Minister over that weekend, and after he'd had a session which I hadn't attended with his inner circle, of which they had discussed this switch from what they called Plan A to Plan B. And of course I hadn't caught up with that because I wasn't aware of it. And so I guess that might have been behind some of that. But I think there's another point here I think it's just worth noting about how I saw my role, particularly at that time. I felt I had to provide leadership to a system that was on the edge of panic at that point. And I didn't have the luxury of, even in private, saying, we're doomed, the system's broken, everyone is useless, because even if I'd said that in private, it would have spread across the system and risked causing panic. And so what I saw my job was to stay calm, notwithstanding my own anxieties, but to stay calm and to project confidence, not overconfidence, but confidence in the people who were working their way through this, that we would find a way through. Because I was very conscious that even the most resilient people would be facing pressure at home and pressure at work. And if those two things come together, even the most resilient people can struggle. And I needed to try and lead those people through this extraordinary and terrifying moment. I can understand, therefore, to some who were not taking that approach, it might have seemed I was off the pace.
In any event, it is a poor reflection of the resilience of the system at the heart of government that the Prime Minister and his chief advisor should have made such claims at all against the Cabinet Secretary. He is the Prime Minister's Cabinet Secretary.
The government's Cabinet Secretary.
The government's Cabinet Secretary.
I'm not sure it's a poor reflection on the resilience or whether it's just a reflection of the stress that those key players were under. You'd have to ask them.
Does what you have said about the fact that you wanted to try to lead and perhaps reduce the level of tension and pressure and try to keep a grip on the system, does that all explain why Sir Patrick Vallance has said repeatedly in his diaries that at a meeting which we assess must have been one of the meetings on Sunday the 15th of March, that you were furious, alternatively gave him a very sour look, alternatively gave him an evil eye, when Sir Patrick Vallance advocated strongly the change in strategy, or as you would say, the acceleration?
I certainly don't remember being furious, and I can't speak for, of course, he didn't tell me at the time that I'd pulled a face, so I can't really speak for that. I'm a diplomat, so we try to maintain some control over our facial expressions. And I wasn't furious. I think I probably did feel, I was worried about confusion. We had essentially two things coming together on that Sunday, as we've touched on already. First was this sense from the Prime Minister's own team, and it's to their credit, they realised this, you heard from Ben Warner, I think, a few days ago, that the disease was moving faster and was more widespread than we had believed. And they took the Prime Minister through that in private in the normal way and talked about a complete change of strategy. And then the formal process, as I've said, the SAGE process coming up through the Chief Scientific Advisor, was really talking about bringing forward measures that they had already said would be needed within a matter of weeks. I guess I was worried as we went into the formal meetings that we needed to impose some order on that. And so if it looked disorderly, I guess I might well have pulled a face.
Might it have been that you were unimpressed by the clear attack on the strategy, the herd immunity strategy, to which you yourself were personally, as we've seen from the email, quite wedded?
I wasn't wedded to it. I think I realised by then that there was no alternative. It was reluctant. And I think, by the way, it's really important that you asked in my Rule 9 request about red teams. I don't know whether you want to pursue that in more detail, but it is really important that policy is challenged and that alternatives are considered, whether the suppression approach you've discussed already or this segmentation approach that I was talking about. But it was clear by that weekend that none of those other options was viable. We didn't have the capabilities in place that would be necessary to even make them viable. A shielding programme, for example, critical to either of those alternatives, let alone the test and trace programme that we've touched on already. And therefore, I was quite clear that the government had no choice but to accelerate into these measures. And fundamentally, the job of the Cabinet Secretary is to advise, but then to step back and let ministers take decisions. I've been in government. I was in government a long time. Governments did not always take decisions that I might have taken if I were in their shoes. But on this occasion, they did.
Of course, on the 23rd of March, the national measures, which we're all too familiar, were announced. I'm not going to ask you about the run-up to that. It's clear from the evidence inquiry said that over the weekend of the 21st and 22nd of March, it became apparent that compliance was not what it should be, that the measures instituted on the 16th of March were proven to be inadequate to stem the spread of the virus. But I want to ask you instead about the process, given that you were Cabinet Secretary, by which the decision to impose that lockdown, if we may use that word, was made. On the Sunday, the 22nd of March, there were two strategy meetings in Number 10. There was a meeting at 3 o'clock on shielding. There was then a meeting at 6:15, COVID-19 strategy, 3-month healthcare strategy, and COVID-19 bill debate. There was then another meeting at 19:40, a post-COVID strategy meeting. Evidence has been received by the inquiry to the effect that, in practice, the debate which took place on that Sunday culminated in a decision or a recognition that the current measures were inadequate and the full lockdown had to be imposed. It's clear from the chronology that on the Monday, the Prime Minister set aside preparation time to address the nation in the evening, and of course he did so address the nation. It's therefore apparent that the decision to impose the lockdown for which he would be required to address the nation had been taken before that prep time at 14:05. But the Cobra meeting, at which the decision to impose the national lockdown did not take place until 5 o'clock, after he had prepared his evening address, and the cabinet meeting, which, as you yourself confirmed, is the ultimate decision-making body in His Majesty or then Her Majesty's government, did not take place to 10:30 the following day. In terms of the constitutional propriety of that course, it does appear as if the practical decision to impose a lockdown was effectively taken and resolved on that Sunday. And it was therefore not a decision which was taken by Cobra or Cabinet. They merely served to endorse a decision which had already been taken.
I think that is largely correct. I presume that parallel processes were happening in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. There was a lot of communication between them. So the Cobra was, if I recall correctly, again, a UK-wide Cobra at which all of that was discussed. And as you've said, the practical decision was taken in a COVID-S meeting earlier that day. And that was, I think that was appropriate. It was a cabinet committee. It had collective responsibility rights. Other ministers attended. It wouldn't, I think, have been practical given the pace required by that point to intensify the measures, to have tried to convene all of the wider formal structures. But I was comfortable at the time. It was constitutionally proper, and the Cobra was essentially a coordination meeting rather than a decision meeting, because all four governments has essentially reached the same conclusion.
Do you accept that the government should have appreciated sooner than it did that the NHS would be overwhelmed, which of course was the trigger for the decision to impose the national lockdown and the measures the week before?
I think I'd go further. I would accept that in almost all of these cases, we should have realised earlier.
Had the risk to the NHS been appreciated sooner, it would have been open to the government, would it not, to introduce the measures that it did introduce on the 16th of March at an earlier stage when the incidence of virus was lower, correct?
Yes, that wasn't the scientific advice, of course, but of course, you're right, the government could have done so.
And had it done so, although we will never know, there must therefore remain the possibility that those measures, if introduced earlier, would have avoided the need for the national lockdown.
It's possible, but I think, Mr. Keith, what I would recommend there is that we really should ask, I don't know whether the inquiry is intending to do so, milady, but we would need really deep academic research to make those judgments around the counterfactuals. I think it's a reasonable supposition. I've read a lot of the other witness statements. I don't know whether it would have been, I'm highly sceptical that it would have been possible to avoid the lockdown altogether. It might well have been possible for it to have been less prolonged. Of course, what we don't know is the effect on the overall number of deaths. But my presumption, having read other witness statements, it's not something which I've ever felt qualified to judge independently, is that earlier would have been better.
And we're not looking for your epidemiological answer. The question presumes that there will only ever be the possibility and that it can never be known. But as the Cabinet Secretary at that time, as a person intimately involved in these momentous decisions, how could you not have a view as to whether or not, if those earlier steps had been taken earlier, a different course might have been open to the government?
As I've said, I agree. I've looked at the other statements. All I'm trying to do is suggest, I don't want to try and impose a judgment now as a non-expert on the decisions we took at the time. The decisions that the government took at the time were based on the scientific advice they were getting. Clearly, and you've heard this from people much more expert than I, had those decisions been taken earlier, then particularly given we didn't know how fast the disease was moving, it would have had a greater impact on that accelerating curve earlier, and one presumes a positive effect on lockdown, casualties, etc. Whether we would have been able to avoid a lockdown, which I think was the initial premise of your question, I'm much more sceptical about that. I think it's more likely to have been about its duration.
It is obvious from the chronology that the ultimate decision was taken on that Sunday and endorsed on the Monday and Tuesday. Once it became clear that the measures of the 16th of March were proven to be inadequate. What debate was there on that Sunday of the weekend of the 21st and 22nd of March and on the Monday as to how much time should be given further to see what behavioural changes might occur in the population at large, so as to reduce the need for a mandatory stay at home order, to obviate the need for the ultimate sanction?
I don't recall much debate at all, but there may be documents, Mr. Keith, that correct that recollection. My recollection is that, I think I refer to this in my witness statement, is that when the 16th of March measures were taken, there was an explicit recognition that they would need to be assessed, and I think we were warned that that would take some time. 21 days, I think we were told at the time, but I might not be correct about that. The advice was very clear, as I recall, from the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor by the end of that week that we needed to go further. It wasn't just compliance. I don't think they were just looking at compliance. The evidence of that was apocryphal as well as data. It was actually they could just see that the numbers were not changing as fast as they would wish, and R was not dropping below 1. And so I don't think there was much debate. They essentially said, it isn't working, we need to go further.
The measures weren't working. That is clear, and you'll recall, of course, that that weekend there were press reports of people attending parks.
Exactly.
And large numbers of people spending the weekend in public. But to what extent was it understood that the population had already taken it upon itself to change its behaviour?
It was clear that groups of the population, cohorts of the population were changing behaviour and others weren't. In a different approach, the advisory targeted approach that we've discussed already, that I was earlier on keen to explore, that might have been okay. But by that stage, given how widespread the disease had become, it was clear that essentially voluntary approach where people made their own judgments wasn't adequate, and the lockdown had to be imposed.
But the only difference between a voluntary restriction and a mandatory one is the force of law applied to the latter. If the population was changing its behaviour, then those social restrictions would be taking effect and would be applicable by virtue of that behavioural change. Why did no one say, well, perhaps they did, let's wait 3 or 4 more days, perhaps get closer to the 21-day expiry period from the 16th of March and see whether or not those behavioural changes will gather pace, will develop, and therefore obviate the need for a mandatory order?
It's almost the mirror image of the conversation we were having earlier. Having realised as we came into the weekend of the 13th and 16th of March that the government had not reacted quickly enough because the disease was further advanced than the government believed and we believed, there was no appetite to take any further risk. And so, of course, in theory, it would have been possible to have delivered the stay-at-home message as an advisory rather than as a mandatory message. But there was some evidence emerging, again, much of it, some of it anecdotal, that having advised people to stay away from crowded indoor spaces like pubs and so on, that they weren't. And I don't know whether it was a focus group. I seem to remember one of the Number 10 team saying, what we're hearing is if you meant us to stay away from the pubs, you'd close the pubs. And so there was a sense that it was necessary to actually impose mandatory measures, given how quickly the disease was moving, in order to minimise that risk.
Lord Sedwill, to use your words, was it not a mirror image of what had taken place before? The government, having underreacted in early March by failing to implement measures short of a lockdown at an earlier stage when the incidence was lower and they may be thought to have had more effect, overreacted on the 23rd and went the whole way, as opposed to allowing the data and the information about the behavioural changes wrought by the 16th of March measures to develop.
Governments were making an invidious risk judgment throughout that, or series of risk judgments throughout that period, and were, of course, following scientific advice. The advice going into the 23rd of March decision was clear that the disease was still exponential, R was still above 1, and therefore it's difficult to see how the government could have done anything else than take measures recommended by the experts, stay at home, etc., necessary to bring R below 1. And you will be aware, I think, Mr. Keith, that there is, I think, I can't recall whether it was in a cabinet or I think it might have been in the cabinet the day after that, where the chief medical officer says he doesn't know whether even those measures will be sufficient and cautions against releasing them too quickly. So even those most extreme measures, we couldn't be confident, government couldn't be confident, were going to be enough to bring R below 1.
You have, if I may say so very fairly, identified the flaws, if flaws they were, in the decision-making process in early March. You identify in your statement an additional issue, which is that the DHSC was neither structured nor resourced for a public health crisis of this magnitude. And you also refer, of course, to the arguably inadequate critical care capacity for public health in this country. Would you accept the proposition that had the DHSC been better structured and resourced for a public health crisis, and had the United Kingdom's critical care capacity been better, the government would have had more options open to it, or at least one alternative option to a lockdown open to it in early March?
Yes, and I would add the point we were discussing earlier about contact tracing, etc. There was a range of capabilities and capacity that would have provided more options at the early stage of the pandemic. Agreed.
Now, following the lockdown decision, the Prime Minister, as is very well known, fell gravely ill, and Dominic Raab MP, the First Secretary, deputised for the Prime Minister. The evidence from Mr. Raab's statement, and of course he will be giving evidence in due course in the inquiry, and also from McNamara's statement, is that the arrangements for Mr. Raab to deputise were simply a reflection of an oral agreement reached between him and Mr. Johnson. Is that correct?
I think for him that was the case. He understood that he was the stand-in, but actually there was more to it than that, in at least my own understanding of it, yes.
And what was that?
Well, we have in the national security area a more formal system of deputies for the Prime Minister in a national security crisis, so that it's possible to maintain what's known as positive political control of things like the nuclear deterrent or decisions about incipient terrorist threats and so on. And it's one of the first conversations a national security advisor, and actually often the cabinet secretary as well when those jobs are separate, has with an incoming Prime Minister. Indeed, I brief leaders of the opposition on it during election campaigns. They need to have decided who those people will be. And as First Secretary, Dominic Raab was the primary deputy for the Prime Minister in cases of that kind.
So are you saying, I apologise for interrupting.
No, sorry.
That in that manual or in guidance, it specifically provides that the First Secretary will deputise or may deputise, as opposed to simply being a guidance that deals with the functions of whoever it is who does deputise?
The guidance was not, for example, contained within the cabinet manual at that stage, the one that had been drafted about a decade earlier. And I recall Helen McNamara and I having a discussion months before saying we really must put it into the next version. The decisions, it doesn't go with the office of First Secretary. There hasn't always been a First Secretary. Sometimes there's a Deputy Prime Minister. Sometimes the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster is essentially the designated most senior minister. And in national security, it isn't just one person. It's usually 3 or 4. But in this case, it was clear that Dominic Raab was the alternate if the Prime Minister were incommunicado or incapacitated.
In April 2020, did that guidance provide that in the event of illness of the Prime Minister, it was the First Secretary who would deputise?
I was very clear that was the case, yes.
When the Prime Minister returned from his illness and took up the reins of government again, to what extent do you assess that he was affected by his illness? You, in the course of a lengthy WhatsApp debate about his propensity to change his mind and to back and veer when making decisions, quite charitably asked whether or not he might indeed have been affected by his illness when making government decisions in April, May, June.
Yes, there are 2 points here, I think. There's the broader question, I don't know whether you want to come back to it with me, but you've touched on with others about his decision-making style. And
We'll come back to that.
Okay, so I'll leave that aside. I was concerned. It took him a long time to recover. He'd had a very serious bout of this. I was lucky. I had a mild bout, and even I had some long COVID symptoms, respiratory symptoms later. And so I wasn't concerned so much about his decision-making style, separate question. It was about stamina, really.
By late April, it had become clear that the lockdown was working. It was effective in reducing the spread of the virus, and the R basic number had been reduced below 1 to a long way below 1. You produced a letter for the Prime Minister dated the 23rd of April, 182367. We can see that it comes from you, the Cabinet Secretary, addressed to the Prime Minister, COVID-19 next steps. You set out a summary of papers which have been produced for the Prime Minister by the Cabinet Office COVID-19 Strategy Unit. And if we go to paragraph 5 on page 2, we can see that you say, so far we have segmented the population into the shielded 1.5 million and everyone else. And in practice, since everyone has locked down, the distinction has been more about support than behaviour. So 2 points. Firstly, the reference to the distinction being more about support than behaviour, is that a reflection of the fact that because the whole population was under a lockdown, there was less of a need to shield those who were being shielded because they were being necessarily shielded by virtue of the reduction in the overall incidence rate of the virus?
Not quite, if I may. It was more about the support, food parcels, etc., for those who were most vulnerable to the disease, who really needed, as well as the stay at home, only go out for provisions once a week, 1 hour's exercise, etc., actually were in a more stringent version of that. And so what I was talking about, that essentially we'd quarantined the entire country.
So behaviourally,
everyone,
less distinction between
exactly.
shielded and non-shielded.
The shielded, whom we might in a different strategy have quarantined and shielded, were getting that support of necessities, etc. That was really the point I was driving at.
Secondly, in the same sentence, you use the word segmented and shielded. Is there a difference? Is shielding perhaps the the word that better reflects the practicalities of a segmentation process, that is to say, physically shielding people, and segmentation is the doctrinal word?
It's almost verb and adjective. That a complete sentence might have said we've segmented the population into the shielded 1.5 million and the unshielded rest. Shielding was about the programmes that we were providing to take care of the vulnerable. And segmentation was just a description of the distinction, I guess, between the two.
All right. On the 7th of May, Cabinet endorsed the phased release aspect of the lockdown.
Yeah.
There had obviously been published a roadmap, and there was a course which the government was resolved to take in terms of sequentially and gradually releasing the constraints of the lockdown. In her statement, Helen McNamara suggests that that roadmap was published without any real cabinet collective agreement process. In your own statement, you say ministers endorsed the phased release of the lockdown. To what extent was that roadmap and release actually debated and decided by cabinet?
It had been developed through the course of April when the Prime Minister was away under the leadership of the First Secretary in a series of ministerial meetings known as the Quad, the chairs of the mix, with some input from other ministers. My recollection is it was discussed in the cabinet meetings he chaired at the same time, but I don't have that evidence to hand. And again, to the best of my recollection, essentially there was an agreement in principle that roadmap, among that group of ministers, that roadmap would proceed subject to endorsement by the Prime Minister and Cabinet when he returned. So there was a sense in which it was conditional, but the roadmap had essentially been worked through by the First Secretary and that group of ministers.
You would say the degree of debate was appropriate?
It was intensive.
136756 is a further note for the Prime Minister dated the 10th of May, COVID-19 campaign next phase. For a while, this is paragraph 1, we thought the United Kingdom was doing better than other countries. Now we fear we're doing worse. There will likely have been significant demographic and cultural reasons for the differential impact. Briefly, what was it, in your opinion, that we had done worse?
It was really a reflection of the emergent data about excess deaths. And we, of course, were warned by the Chief Medical Officer and others that we wouldn't know until later, given the differential counting methods, etc. But there had been a sense, and you've heard this in other evidence, in the early spring that the UK was in better shape. We'd been told our pandemic plans were excellent, etc. And that emergent data by that stage suggested that excess deaths in the UK were higher than broadly comparable countries. And I think it was probably a reflection of that. And I think there was a lot of media coverage of that at that time.
Page 2 at paragraphs 3 to 6, you outline some of the areas in which, in your assessment, the system of government, particularly with reference to the DHSC and Public Health England, had failed the country. Is this section reflective of what you have subsequently described as the way in which the DHSC was under-resourced, under-structured, and incapable of dealing with the fragmented nature of the provision of healthcare and social care in this country?
Yes, in effect, that sentence was a summary of this thinking. And the point I'm making here, I think it's really important to note this. I know it's more a Module 1 point, was this was the result of decisions taken by several governments over many years. I think the House of Lords report refers to a real terms cut over about the previous 5 years in public health budgets across England of about 10%, for example. But that was just a single example of a broader, the outcome of a series of decisions, all essentially sensible in their own terms, but that have resulted in this position going into the pandemic.
All right. In late May, the government was obliged to make decisions about the degree to which the lockdown would be released and how fast it would go through the successive phases. And on the 22nd of May, you communicated with Simon Case, then a permanent secretary in number 10, 303245 at page 2. And you respond to a WhatsApp from Simon Case. He says, away from more Don drama, we had a good meeting earlier with the Prime Minister. He and Rishi readily agreed a package quite quickly. Your call, he's referring there to you, isn't he? Your call about not including Patrick and Chris was genius. It removed that dynamic. Lord Sedwill, is that reference to the plan suggested, apparently, by you to Simon Case that Sir Patrick Vallance and Sir Chris Whitty should not be present at a meeting at which a package for lockdown release would be debated, because you and Simon Case didn't want the Prime Minister to feel the full force of scientific advice, which was very well known in the case of Sir Patrick and Sir Chris, to lean towards applying the maximum degree of care and caution when releasing the country from the lockdown measures?
No, it wasn't. And if you look at the last sentence of Simon Case's WhatsApp to me, he says Patrick V. Vallance is happy with it. So I can't recall the exact sequence, but my presumption is that we would have done a lot of, probably Simon would have done a lot of work in advance of the meeting between the Prime Minister and Chancellor to make sure that whatever was on the table was acceptable to the experts. And this was just a question of managing a meeting of that kind where the Prime Minister and Chancellor were in different, came to it in different positions. And so it was just about managing the dynamics of an informal meeting. But if you look at the actual substance of it, the substance was something that the scientists supported.
Patrick Vallance was happy with the outcome, with whatever was agreed. The reference to dynamic and Simon Case's praise for your suggestion that the meeting not include Patrick and Chris, and he describes as being genius, again, was that because you simply didn't wish Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty to directly engage with the Prime Minister, to speak to him directly, lest their approach to the necessary caution that had to be applied might prevail, might win the day?
I'm not sure that's a fair question, Mr. Keith, but you tell me, Mrs. Lord Sedwill, is that a fair question?
I will have a go. Thank you, Milady, but let me have a go at answering it within that boundary that you've implied. I suspect, I don't recall exactly. This was clearly a conversation I'd had with him earlier. You've heard from others that the Prime Minister was often at his best in small meetings. There would have been a difference of view between him and the Chancellor at this point. I think the Prime Minister actually had already been briefed extensively by Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty. It wasn't that they didn't have access to the Prime Minister, they had plenty of access to him. This would have simply been about handling the meeting and presumably trying to ensure that the dynamics of that meeting were more productive, that the Chancellor wasn't coming into a meeting feeling that his perspective was going to be overwhelmed by essentially a cohort of people sitting the other side of the table, that they could have a genuine one-to-one discussion. And I'm comforted, as I said, that Patrick Vallance's being content with what they agreed. It must have been the case, therefore, given the Chancellor would have presumably been pushing for something to go further faster, that the Prime Minister had whatever advice he needed from Patrick Vallance firmly in his mind. I think that is probably about as far as I can go, Mr. Keith.
All right, well, I'm not going to harry you further on that. 303245.
Are you moving to a different matter or the same?
A different document. Similarly, that's a convenient point.
I hope you're all right to come back this afternoon, Lord Sedwill. I'm afraid looks like, because there are also some questions from the core participants.
So I understand, my lady, of course.
Thank you. 10 to 2, please. Yes, Mr. Keith.
On the 22nd of July, Lord Sedwill, you had a WhatsApp conversation with Simon Case in which you debated what you described as a cunning route into segmentation. Could we have up 303245 at page 10, where you refer to at 1624 the only answer I can see beyond the existing mitigations is Stalinist segmentation. The lockdown hits the young and healthy, virus kills the old and sick. We have to confront that brutal truth and organise for it, notwithstanding CW's. Is that Chris Whitty on this occasion's
I presume so.
scepticism about the practicalities? And if we go forward to page 11 to set the context, we can see at 11:21, in the middle of the page, Mark said, well, I had a good session with the data people while in Oxford. There might be a cunning route into segmentation if you want to discuss. And then Simon Case says this at 11:24. We agreed with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor yesterday to set up a little cell in the task force to draw up a plan for segmentation. They said they were up for it. And then at 11:29, at the end of your WhatsApp, having described the sort of rating process or the system which might be considered, I think you mean I don't buy the sage argument that it's all too difficult. Simon Case, neither the Prime Minister nor the Chancellor of the Exchequer buy the sage argument either. I'm just not sure this is a sage issue. This is about political will and implementation of policy, and then personal behaviour, not science. Mark said, well, exactly. Two questions. Firstly, the inquiry's heard evidence about how in August and September the COVID task force looked specifically at the issue of segmentation and whether it was practically possible as, of course, an alternative to the more stringent sort of intervention which might otherwise be utilised. Is this the genesis, do you think, of that policy work done by the COVID task force?
I wouldn't necessarily claim the genesis, but a contribution to it, I would hope.
Secondly, it is clear from Mr. Case's observation, with which you agree with the use of the word exactly, that to the extent that Mr. Case was describing the government's decision to investigate segmentation and describing its political will and implementation of policy, the government really wasn't following the science here at all. SAGE plainly advises and did advise on the need for shielding, on the epidemiological necessity and on the epidemiological consequences of shielding. Why were you agreeing that SAGE and its position and its arguments should be dismissed in this way?
Not so much dismissed, but not necessarily accepted without challenge. Shielding, as we discussed earlier, effective shielding would be a crucial element of any segmentation approach, essentially quarantining and protecting those for whom the disease was dangerous, whilst managing its spread, as we've discussed before, through those for whom it was unpleasant. And the differential impact of the disease was even more striking by this point. I think the number of under 50s who'd been hospitalised was even smaller than had been expected, etc. That doesn't, of course, mean younger people, particularly those with comorbidities, weren't at risk, but with sufficient critical care capacity, etc., they could be properly treated, and so that was the question. The reason here was essentially it was again testing whether Now we had better knowledge of the disease, more capabilities in place. Was there a way of taking on that different approach? And I think it is right. That is fundamentally a policy question rather than a scientific one. The scientists would have to advise, but you have to take that advice into account whilst working out, is there a policy route through this?
The fact that Sage had advanced an argument at all is evidence, is it not, that the government had asked Sage for its view. You are opining upon the fact that, in your opinion, Sage's argument was that it was too difficult. So you'd asked Sage to address this issue.
I can't recall whether there was the nature of the commission to Sage. I just don't know. It would probably have been through the CMO and the chief scientific advisor. My recollection is that Sage produced some formal advice in early September, I think. I think it came almost at the time of my final cabinet on exactly this question. So there must have been a commission to Sage. I don't know whether that followed from this discussion or whether I was simply inferring from what I knew from Sage that their position at this point.
When you say on this question, do you mean the question of segmentation?
Yes, milady, yeah.
But having asked Sage for its view, however it was commissioned, Sage having proffered its view, having also declared that the government was, in a general sense, and I appreciate it's a general sense, only following the science, it is rather curious that by characterising this debate as a policy or a political issue, Sage's opinion was, in principle, simply rejected as being, well, just too difficult.
I don't think rejected, but I think by that stage the government had actually said, I think in a cabinet meeting in a discussion about 2 metres versus 1 metre distancing, etc., that I think there was more recognition, and of course we were in much calmer waters by this stage, at least temporarily. There was a recognition by ministers that scientific expertise was an input, but wasn't, unlike going into the first lockdown, wasn't necessarily the only determinant of government policy.
All right. Moving on to another topic. The WhatsApps between yourself and Simon Case, in another regard, demonstrated a debate that you had about the process by which Leicester and other places were placed under local restrictions following the exit from the national lockdown. So that is to say, in June and July of 2020. And if we could have up, please, 303-245 at page 7. At 2124. I can't. Ah, yes, thank you very much. Towards the top of the page, Simon Case. Local leaders were refusing to accept the legitimacy of PHE data. Chris Whitty has to argue with Mayor and others earlier today. The legitimacy of the government to be accepted has been so dangerously eroded, it seems, for fairly obvious reasons. Shortly, in what way did you understand Mr. Case to be suggesting that the legitimacy of the government had been eroded? In what way did you understand him to be saying it had been eroded?
I presume that related to the Barnard Castle incident and the government's response to it.
So the Barnard Castle incident, comprising the whole affair and the press conference, was having an impact on the 29th of June in relation to the government's dealings with local mayors.
Yes, I presume that's what we were referring to there. And just on the Barnard Castle incident, I think it isn't fair just to focus on the incident and indeed Mr. Cummings' own press conference. In some ways, that was contained and managed. I don't know whether we're going to come back to this, but I was particularly concerned about the reaction of the Health Secretary and the Attorney General afterwards to it, where I felt they were undermining the legal framework in some of their communications, and we had to get that under control. But I felt the whole fine. But it would have been the whole Barnard Castle incident, not just the incident itself and Mr. Cummings' press conference. It was a broader question, I think.
At 22:02:27, you say the mayor actually a class act, Hancock trying to scapegoat him. Who do you believe? Lord Sedwill, Why did you not believe the Secretary of State, himself a minister of the Crown?
I felt, and I know we may come back to this, it felt to me by that point that rather than treating the mayor as essentially a partner in governance, he was being treated as a political opponent, and there was a politicised approach. And this is obviously a very shorthand discussion of the kind one might have on the phone. It's important to remember that. It is only a WhatsApp exchange. And as you see, I'm asking Simon Case, who was obviously on this full time by this stage, what was behind all of that.
I'm not concerned with the debate between Mr. Hancock and the local mayor.
Yeah.
I'm referring specifically to you posing the question, who do you believe? You are putting the candour or the honesty or the reasonableness of the belief in the local mayor or Mr. Hancock into issue. One of them was your colleague, a Secretary of State, a Minister of the Crown. That is rather surprising, is it not?
Yes, but one was also a senior local government figure. And of course, all of these, if you're the Cabinet Secretary, are important.
Further down the page, we can see at 22:17, you say, be careful of trusting CW's judgment on this. Is that Chris Whitty or Chris Wormold?
I presume Chris Wormold, and I don't quite know why I would have said that, but I presume that's who I'm referring to.
The big problem is Hancock. Then further down the page at 22:21.53, but I mostly blame Hancock. Déjà vu, that was how we spent the early spring. And then Mr. Case says at 22:46, I've only just realised that we have no senior DHSC officials anywhere near this. Where was Matt's Perm Sec or lead DG? We're engaging with the Public Health England, the clinicians, etc., but there is no one around driving the policy side of operational lockdown on Matt's behalf. Weird absence. So, and you say welcome to the last 6 months. So 2 points, please. Firstly, the process by which Mr. Hancock's truthfulness or candour or lack of candour or general approach, however one describes it, and it's obviously a matter for the inquiry, was not an issue that was confined to perhaps one or two individuals, or notably Mr. Cummings. There was a general issue, a general problem surrounding Mr. Hancock. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, and you heard from Helen McNamara on that last week.
And secondly, this issue of where was Matt's Perm Secretary, there's a weird absence. Was there at the same time a problem functionally with the operation of the DHSC insofar as on the civil service side of things, there were failures to produce policy or to stand up and be counted when it came to negotiating policy or producing material that central government and the Cabinet Office and Number 10 requested?
It looks from what Simon Case is saying in that text that's the case. He's clearly concerned that DHSC at an official and expert level is not on top of the Leicester question. I think that was probably the first time that element of it had been drawn to my attention. By then we had the COVID task force, as you said, and I think what this exchange is revealing is just how challenging it was for them as well in dealing with a situation when their Secretary of State is essentially in a quite high-profile political row with the local mayor.
Another topic, you proposed in late May the establishment of COVID-O and COVID-S. We know that because Helen McNamara and Simon Case produced an advice dated the 22nd of May, which recommended the establishment of those committees. And a great deal of evidence has been received by the inquiry in relation to their operation. Why did you propose that there be this division between COVID-S and COVID-O, COVID strategy, COVID operational? And to the extent that COVID-0 was concerned with the drawing up of policy and operational matters and everything short of strategizing, was that not duplicative of the COVID task force, as to which we've had considerable evidence from Mr. Ridley as to the broad range of its functions?
COVID-0 and COVID-S were cabinet committees, so essentially ministerial committees with officials attending to support. The task force was the official group essentially combining teams who had hitherto been in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, C19 secretariats, etc., into a single official group. So they were distinct. The task force was the group of officials led by Simon Case, and COVID-0 and COVID-S were cabinet committees. There was an obvious risk of duplication between S and O. I wouldn't necessarily, although we called them strategy and operations, in some ways it was the big decisions the Prime Minister needed to be personally involved in COVID-S, and COVID-0 those that he could leave to a wider group of ministers, chaired by Michael Gove as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. And essentially it replicated the model that we'd applied to Brexit the previous year, where overall Brexit policy was driven in a group chaired by the Prime Minister, XS, and no deal planning, etc., was led in a group chaired by Michael Gove as CDL XO. So it was a straight replica of a model we knew worked for that Prime Minister.
The COVID response machinery was not, of course, the same as the machinery dealing in its entirety dealing with the preparation for a no-deal Brexit.
No. There were echoes, though.
There were overlaps, and of course you took the COVID-0, COVID-S structure from XO and XS. Did you find in reality that there was a degree of duplication between O and S? And in terms of the officials, the non-ministerial officials who attended COVID-0 and the CTF, that there was a degree of overlap?
I imagine there was some. I don't recall anyone bringing it to my attention as a problem that needed to be resolved. The task force would have supported both those cabinet committees.
All right. May the inquiry presume that from the need to rearrange the arrangements in the heart of the Cabinet Office in May, from what of course we now know to be the report produced by Helen McNamara in relation to the working practices and the toxicity of the atmosphere and so on and so forth, that there were matters that were fundamentally wrong with the operation of the Cabinet Office between February and May?
I think it's important to look at the sequence there. The task force, COVID-0, COVID-S, were established when we were in calmer waters. We were coming out of the first lockdown, had a much better understanding, etc., and they were planning the future. Whereas when we established the MIGs, we were going into the storm, if you like, of the first lockdown, and of course seeking to accelerate preparations that weren't ready for that lockdown. And so we've got to be careful not to overdo the distinctions between them. They were operating in different circumstances. In terms of the officials and the institutional culture, the first point I should make is the report that Helen McNamara and Martin Reynolds did was triggered by me, and I think the phrase superhero bun fight was actually used by my private secretary with me, and I essentially said, right, we better get onto this. I think there were some reasons for that. Going into the lockdown, into that intense phase, I was conscious that we would lose people. There'd be people off sick, isolating, mental health issues and so on. And therefore I deliberately over-resourced. I deliberately ensured that each DG had a primary function and a sort of understudy function as well, so that when someone became ill, if they weren't able to operate from home, there wouldn't be a break in service, if you like. As people returned to work, there were clearly some tensions around that. Some people had been there throughout. Some people were new. Some people returned after illness. And it was necessary by that stage to restore a more normal way of operating. But I think it was right to over-resource going in. That was certainly my experience of other crises. Worry less about overlaps and more about gaps.
The Prime Minister's own chief advisor has described, as you know well, the Cabinet Office for which you bore ultimate responsibility as a dumpster fire, as being bloated with too many senior levels, too many Director Generals, duplication, confusion, huge numbers of communication and engagement staff. And on the functional side, as essentially failing in its core function, which was to synthesize data, information policy from other government departments, to liaise with them, to broker between them, and to hold the heart of government together. What do you say?
Some of that, but not most of it is fair. As I've explained why there was deliberately some duplication going in, I felt it was necessary to over-resource. I've also heard him say we had the wrong people in the wrong jobs, and yet in particular, the key directors general who worked on COVID clearly had the confidence of the number 10 machine because they were either retained or in some cases promoted into other roles for them. The wider Cabinet Office, outside the Cabinet Secretariat, I don't know whether he was referring to some of that, but we sought to clarify that as we went. It was necessary. We had to set up 36 programmes across government to try and ensure the government was able to respond to the crisis as it moved at pace in March. Inevitably, there was quite a lot of friction around that, and we sought to knock that into shape through the course of March and into April.
You have given evidence in relation to the failure at the heart of government to appreciate that there was an absence of cross-government planning, to bring the departmental planning such as it was into shape and into the centre. There was a failure to appreciate, to become aware in sufficient time of the scale of the crisis. There was only a dawning realisation of the systemic problems at the heart of the DHSC, the primary lead government department at the heart of this public health crisis. Those were all failures which occurred within the Cabinet Office and on your watch. Do you agree?
Yes, and we sought to address them as soon as we realised that we had those issues.
Turning to the Prime Minister, you will be aware, of course, of the evidence received by the inquiry that, in the opinion of his Director of Communications, this was the wrong crisis for this Prime Minister's skill set. And to summarise the criticisms from Mr. Cummings, for all his undoubted political skills, Mr. Johnson's propensity to oscillate, to be unable to manage a cohesive team, and to direct government machinery consistently and effectively. Are those opinions with which you agree?
I recognise them, but I wouldn't express it that way myself. And indeed, I think there's a separate point here, which is essentially, in essence, a question for me, which is, as I said in my witness statement, Mr. Keith, part of my job was to build around any Prime Minister a mechanism or a set of mechanisms that enabled them to both make decisions and then those decisions to be enacted effectively. And I certainly didn't think it would have been responsible to say, oh, well, the Prime Minister's way of working isn't effective in these circumstances, and then throw my hands up. It was my job to make it work.
No one is suggesting otherwise.
No, indeed, no, thank you. So just briefly, one of the reasons I sought to create forcing mechanisms, collective governance mechanisms, was that I knew that the process in number 10 was a dialectic. I'd seen this with the Prime Minister before, notoriously, of course, in 2016, but actually in the autumn of 20 19, he would be gung-ho for no-deal Brexit in one moment and much more reflective and trying to identify the landing zone for a deal, particularly in private, say with me, in another moment. And I recognise that was, Lord Lister touched on this, that dialectic is how he got to big decisions. It's exhausting for the people in his inner circle, but my job was to try and ensure that we had a mechanism around that, for which I used essentially the collective governance mechanisms, which would force a decision, and once that decision was made, ensure that the government stuck to it.
You recognise, of course, that there is a considerable amount of evidence from the evening notes from Sir Patrick Vallance, from Mr. Cummings's evidence, from the evidence of officials and advisors in Downing Street in the Cabinet Office, that there were problems concerning Mr. Johnson's leadership, his oscillation, his ability to build an effective and cohesive team. To the extent that your obligation was to build a system around him that would enable proper decision-making, facilitate his job as Prime Minister, doesn't the fact that these complaints and these concerns continued throughout February, March, April, May, all the way through to the end of 2020 show that your attempts to build a corrective system failed?
I don't agree with that. They're complaining about how he got to decisions and how he operated with his inner circle. And I didn't think there was any way I could change that. This was the way he operated. My job was essentially to create a system which insulated the rest of Whitehall and turned whatever process of getting to a decision in the centre of government into regular government decisions and business. And the main mechanisms I used for that, as I said, was trying to ensure the last group of people from whom he would hear would be his cabinet colleagues and in collective agreement. I didn't think I could address the underlying question. That was just going to happen. My job was to take that and try and make sure that the rest of the system worked nonetheless.
The very fact that the Cabinet Secretary has to insulate his own Prime Minister the Prime Minister from the rest of Whitehall is a sorry reflection of the workings of government at that level.
It was a very challenging period, but as I said, my job was not to judge the way a Prime Minister makes a decision. They're democratically elected. It was to try to ensure that however they got to the decisions and however much stray voltage there was at the centre, and there was an awful lot, that the system of government worked. And I sought to try and achieve that, particularly on the big decisions the government took going into and coming out of the lockdowns.
My suggestion to you, Lord Sedwill, is that to a large extent your worthy efforts failed. Notably, in August 2020, Sir Patrick Vallance records in his evening notes these words: Sedwill came back saying this administration is brutal and useless. Did you say those words?
I don't recall doing so, and I can't actually recall what might have prompted it, but I have no doubt, I don't doubt Sir Patrick's memory. It must have been a moment of acute frustration with something. I don't know what.
303245, some further WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr. Case in May 2020, page 1. We don't need to go through them all in detail, but if you look at, by way of example, 082932, Mr. Case and you are debating whether or not he is prepared to do a job in Downing Street. He says, I'm not willing to agree to do any job back in this version of the centre without guarantees, honest conversations with the PM about behaviours. I'll work for you in the PM, I will not work for Dom. There are then repeated references to you saying, reinforcing my conversation with the PM about behaviours, very helpful. Simon Case, there are guarantees about behaviour. At 22:25, he says, I'm appalled that the PM has done all this and caused all of this damage. That's 22, 25, 32. Thank you. And on pages 2, 6, and 9 of this group, there are further references to the behaviour in Downing Street, the people that the Prime Minister has surrounded himself with, references to them being so mad, they're madly self-defeating. I've never seen a bunch of people less well-equipped to run the country. Who, when you said these people, were you and Mr. Case referring to?
Did I say these people? I'm not sure. I think anyway.
PM and the people he chooses to surround himself with are basically feral. You say,
Oh, right.
I've got the bite marks.
Yeah. Well, that's
Who are those people?
Well, as you will see, Mr. Keith, there is sometimes some gallows humour in some of these these WhatsApps. I think so. That first exchange came after a point where there'd been very severe friction between me and the Prime Minister and his immediate team. Martin Reynolds' witness statement refers to it, although the Prime Minister at no point expressed a loss of confidence. This is a little later. I think this is the Prime Minister and some of his immediate team. And
we can take the document off the screen, thank you.
And Lord Lister referred to some of this yesterday.
It is apparent from Mr. Case's hesitation at taking the job of being Permanent Secretary Number 10 and ultimately Cabinet Secretary that the behaviour as he perceived it and as you perceived it of people in Downing Street was positively affecting his willingness to take that role. You were aware that the behaviour, whatever it was and from whomsoever it was coming, was affecting the stability of the working arrangements in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office. You were aware that it was affecting the stability of the civil service at the highest point of government.
Correct. Sorry.
Yes. Those were very serious matters indeed, given particularly that the government was in the maw of the beast facing this crisis.
Correct. And I think you put to Lord Lister yesterday a remark from me in another WhatsApp with Simon Case in which I think I say something like, it is difficult to get people to march to the sound of gunfire if you shoot them in the back. That is a strong statement about the institutional culture.
And I want to be clear about this. This pervasive atmosphere, the behaviour, the working practices, they were having, were they not, a direct impact on the efficacy, the efficiency of the system, the ability of the government to make proper, timely and appropriate decisions.
We sought to minimise the real effect on the big decisions, and we discussed that a few moments ago. I thought that was my job to do that. So there was no doubt it was a very stressful issue, the institutional behaviour at the centre, the stray voltage, etc. I think, broadly speaking, in terms of the really big decisions, the timeliness of them, given that that government and other governments who didn't have that behaviour right at the centre made decisions, broadly speaking, at the same time, I think there's a question as to whether we were not successful in ensuring that actually the right decisions were taken at the right time, notwithstanding the particular challenges of that regime.
Another issue was the absence of female perspective, 303-245, page 10. Mark Sedwill, PP's interjection, is that a reference to Priti Patel?
Yes.
A reminder that we need more of the female perspective. That's at 16:24:28. Just before the gap. Thank you very much. And Helen McNamara, in her evidence, or rather in her written statement, has noted that there was in government, in Number 10, a striking absence of humanity or perspective about people or families or how people actually lived. Would you agree?
Yes, and I did bring this up in one of the, it may even be, Mr. Keith, in one of the documents we've already looked at. I recall commenting about lockdowns that the experience of lockdown for those lucky enough to have a garden, a laptop, a cardo, etc., was wholly different to that of a single mother living in a bedsit with a cleaning job across town. I was acutely concerned about that.
And turning lastly in this context to Mr. Hancock himself, as I promised I would. Mr. Cummings says that at one point you said to him, the British system does not work if ministers lie. And the document 303245, WhatsApp messages between you and Simon Case, again at page 3, shows that you and he discussed 1911-04. You say totally incompetent. They don't even understand the regulations they authorise. At page 5, you refer to the DHSC's laissez-faire attitude. This is 1101. It's 1108. It's been quite a pattern. Matt over-promising, under-delivering, and Chris on the touch line. I had hoped we'd corrected it. And on page 7, there are references by you to Hancock all over the place and to questions about his candour and his grip, as well as his tendency to overpromise. Give us, please, an understanding of how damaging, how destructive this loss of confidence in Mr. Hancock was in the context of the United Kingdom government facing a health crisis of this magnitude, and there being a fundamental lack of confidence in the ability of the Secretary of State for Health to do what was required.
Clearly damaging. And I did raise, I don't remember the exact terms, I didn't keep contemporaneous notes. I did raise really 3 questions with the Prime Minister throughout those months. One was about Mr. Hancock's candour, and you heard from Chris Wormold, you've just referenced it, over-promising, overconfident, over-assurance. We had to use the Programme Management Office to double-check what we were being told so that we could try and make sure there wasn't an effect in terms of, we did understand whether programmes were actually on track as we were hearing, for example, and some of that continued. The second issue was this question of, particularly after the Barnard Castle incident, of politicisation, where I expressed myself at a time when my own relations with the Prime Minister were quite strained, as you have seen, quite sharply about the risk to the legal framework that public statements from the Health Secretary and indeed the then Attorney General were making. And I felt we saw some more of that in the Leicester affair. And then I did have a conversation with the Prime Minister in the summer. These are very normal and except in the circumstances of this inquiry, entirely private conversations between the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary and in this case, the number 10 Permanent Secretary. But obviously I understand the unique circumstances of the inquiry about whether he was the right person to lead the next phase, whatever the PM's judgment about him, on the basis that I'd already said I felt structural reform of health and social care was necessary.
You told the Prime Minister to sack Mr. Hancock.
I don't think I used that word with him, but I did use it in a WhatsApp with Simon Case.
And you described it thus: to save lives and protect the NHS.
That was gallows humour. That's an echo. I mean, and I realise, of course, inappropriate even in a private exchange. Not something I would have ever expected to be public. I was echoing the. It was gallows humour, echoing the slogan, the communications of the earlier on. So,
but it was
that is not to be overinterpreted.
No, but the words, I told the Prime Minister to sack Mr. Hancock, reflect the seriousness of the position and the grave position in which the government had found itself with being unable to have confidence in its Secretary of State.
That would have followed the conversation I would have had with the Prime Minister about whether a change would be right for the next phase. Of course, as I said, I had raised my concerns with the Prime Minister. That was not intended for him to remove Mr. Hancock, but to take a grip on the issue. In the end, the Prime Minister has to make these judgments.
As it happens, in his witness statement to this inquiry at paragraph 699, Mr. Johnson says, "I did not have any concerns regarding the performance of any cabinet minister, including Matt Hancock. I do not think that I received any advice from Sir Mark Sedwill that Matt should be removed." What do you say to that?
I can see how he might remember it that way. I did not provide formal advice to the Prime Minister. So there are occasions when a Cabinet Secretary has to give advice to a Prime Minister about the status of a minister, particularly if there's been a breach of the ministerial code. And I did have to give both Prime Ministers I served advice in that way. So that's formal advice, written, etc. These were, as I've just expressed, conversations about Mr. Hancock. I don't think I would have used the word sack with the Prime Minister himself, although I acknowledge I said it to Mr. Case. But he would have been under no illusions as to my view about what was best.
You left him under no doubt whatsoever that he would be better advised to replace Mr. Hancock with another minister as Secretary of State for Health.
Indeed.
A different topic, almost there, Lord Sedwill, legislation. The inquiry understands that the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 was not used as a basis for the COVID legislation or regulations. As it happened, the main Coronavirus Act was passed by Parliament on the 25th of March and received royal assent the same day. It had been through every stage in the House of Commons and the House of Lords on a single day, the 23rd of March. In the event, the government used, in England at any rate, the Public Health Control of Diseases Act 1984 as the overarching legislation under which to promulgate the statutory instrument, the secondary legislation that was the coronavirus regulations. So firstly, having passed the coronavirus bill and it having passed into law as the Act, why was the 1964 Act used as the overarching legislation for the main coronavirus legislation, regulations?
The Coronavirus Act went beyond that, so there were other provisions in it.
There were.
In that specific case, I think at the time, it was because we were already essentially more familiar with the Public Health Act. There was a need to move extremely quickly to put those into law and create the legal certainty, in particular, the police needed to enforce the regulations. So a judgment was just made that it would be simpler and give better legal clarity to use existing rather than brand new legislation that hadn't yet essentially been fully implemented.
The inquiry is curious because it's received evidence in Module 1, of course, that a great deal of time and energy was devoted to a pandemic flu bill. That then became the coronavirus bill, which then became the Act. But in the actuality, in the event, it wasn't even used for the primary regulations in those first few days.
No, the Public Health Act was, and on reflection, it may have been possible to have drafted a different version of the coronavirus bill so that the powers didn't overlap between the two pieces of legislation.
And the Civil Contingencies Act wasn't used, was it because of the very unusual and draconian nature of the powers in Part 2 of that Act, which require ministers, if they use that Act to issue regulations, to appoint emergency coordinators for each part of the United Kingdom. And obviously there are very real concerns about the civil liberties aspects of such a step. Was that what caused ministers to shy from using the Civil Contingencies Act and instead then to use the Coronavirus Act and the Public Health Act?
It would have been a factor. Another factor, though, and probably the more important, was that the Civil Contingencies Act is only to be used if there is no legislative alternative, in a sense, if there's simply no time, because it allows ministers to make essentially make law by decree. And then, of course, that has to be reviewed by Parliament at a very regular intervals. But the underlying premise is that that can only happen if there simply isn't the time or opportunity to create an alternative vehicle. And for the reasons you set out, there was in this case.
Finally, you had, of course, as you have indicated, a most difficult conversation with Mr. Johnson on or around the 14th of May 2020, when you agreed to move on later in the year to end being Cabinet Secretary in September. Regardless of the whys and wherefores of how you came to agree to such a move or why it happened, do you think that the means of your departure, the nature of that decision and that meeting, and the way in which you came to leave, affected the stability of the civil service and the higher echelons of government?
I should just note, just for the record, the decision wasn't taken in that meeting. There was a discussion in that meeting. For the reasons you said, I think there's no need to go through all of the toing and froing. A lot of it is in the WhatsApps and other messages. The final decision, which I took, was in early June.
Right.
And with his agreement. And that goes to the point you've raised. I was conscious that the departure of a Cabinet Secretary, particularly, although we were in a calmer period, but particularly in these circumstances, would undoubtedly be destabilising. And many of my colleagues urged me to stay on, fight through the next set of pressure and stick it out. I was also conscious, however, having had over a year of it, that it was also destabilising for the system to have constant hostile attacks on the Cabinet Secretary and also the office of the Cabinet Secretary. And that predated Mr. Johnson, but it was particularly his government, but it had become particularly acute. Distortions, leaks, some cases just things that were simply untrue. There was a story put out that in his absence, I had conspired with I don't know who to postpone the implementation of Brexit. I mean, completely untrue, completely untrue. And so I was conscious that that was also destabilising for the civil service, and this First Division Association and others talked about that. And in the end, it was personally wearing as well. There's only so much lightning any lightning conductor can take. But in the end, I concluded that a fresh Cabinet Secretary appointed by that Prime Minister and his team, they'd have to stop that those anonymous attacks, etc., would have to stop. And therefore, I felt that might be the opportunity for a fresh start. And so on balance, I concluded for both professional as well as personal reasons that it was the right time to go.
But those attacks were internecine. They were coming from your own side.
Yes.
Helen McNamara says in her statement, and perhaps we should give her the final word, it made those in the civil service in the centre less confident about challenging. No one was safe if the Cabinet Secretary was not, and dealing with the unravelling preoccupied a number of us for critical weeks. Mr. Cummings says it was a bomb. From a government level, it kind of kicked week after week after week of debilitating argument across the system. Putting aside the issue of whether or not he was entitled to express that view at all, would you agree with the sentiments of both those witnesses?
I would, but as I said, there was the countervailing factor of what the destabilising behaviour already, and that's why I made the judgment I did that it was the right time to go.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Keith.
Just before, there are some questions from call participants, but just before, at the risk of indulging in another seminar, as I nearly did with Lord Lister yesterday, in times of national emergency, I'm afraid, I think I probably speak on behalf of the average citizen, I just assumed there would be structures in place that suddenly you would have whether it's COBRA for a national emergency, but there'd be other structures beneath the main structure that would just slip into place. but I'm not getting the feeling that that's what happened. You ended up with the ministerial implementation groups, and then they got replaced by the task force COVID-O, COVID-S. Should there be a system whereby there is in the cabinet manual, in times of national emergency, this is what's going to happen, so that everybody knows where they're going and what they're going to be doing?
Yes, I think there should. I think it's important, my lady, to remember the scale of this crisis. This was the biggest crisis the country had faced since World War II, and government is reshaped by crises of that scale. It's inevitable that it will be. And for the most part, the crisis management machinery for whether it's for floods or terrorist attacks or foot and mouth, etc., works reasonably well. And there's a very big question for governments about how much resource they're prepared to devote to contingent capability, and we discussed
Buying insurance.
Yeah, exactly. But we discussed the kind of capabilities that did not exist in health and social care. Those are not trivial capabilities in which to invest, and of course, in many cases, those capabilities are still not there. If we were hit by another pandemic today, for example, so those are big choices. I do think, though, my lady, there is your point is a good one. That I think the cabinet manual should have more material on this, so that it's more familiar to the whole of government, not just the crisis experts, if you like. And I think, for example, if we take the example of the MIGs, it's obviously a matter for you, but if we were faced by another crisis of this scale, having a group looking at the issue itself, in this case health, having a group looking at public services and their impact and continuity of public services, having a group looking at the economy, having a group looking at the international, those would be sensible ways to organise ourselves, frankly, whatever we call them, and making sure the devolved administrations are properly engaged. I think the same is true as well. Obviously, one needs to make those things work effectively, and we had to amend as we went. But I agree that this is something that government, I hope, has already learnt some lessons ahead of your own, my lady, about this, and I hope some of that work is in hand.
But when you have those different committees, I mean, there's so much overlap, and having got used to having meetings involving, dare I say it, officials, I know that before any meeting takes place, there's probably an officials meeting, and then there's a pre-briefing meeting and a briefing meeting. And if you have all these different committees, so public services is one MIG, and then health is another. Well, isn't health a public service? I mean, they overlap in so many different ways, don't they? Well, we drew involve duplication.
We drew up the terms of reference so that there were fairly clear boundaries between them. And in truth, the move from the MIGs to COVID-O in particular, there was slightly less to that than has sometimes been apparent, in that the international one was wrapped back into the National Security Council, which hadn't really met, and the economic one was wrapped into the government's existing economic committee, cabinet committee, which also hadn't met. Regrettably, that meant that the DAs were no longer directly involved in the same way. So in some ways, it was a merger of the health and public services MIGs was really what happened with the creation of the COVID-O structure. And I think there's just a judgment about the phasing of this. I think going into the lockdown, there was so much work to do across government because we didn't have all the plans and programmes we needed. There were 3 dozen programmes, of which a minority were in health, across the whole of government. If it had been a single ministerial committee trying to deal with all of that, they would have been in constant session. But you're right, Malone, it's a judgment about how you divvy things up, when you put them together, and obviously trying to make sure that the culture is of collaboration and high trust and so on, so that the boundaries are interfaces, not barriers.
And when you've divided, I think I might have said my final question, but anyway, my inquiry, I'll change the rules. When you have different bodies doing different aspects, how do you make sure that the final decision makers on obviously the most important, the key decisions, which is what Module 2 is all about, that they do have all the factors there that they can balance, so that you have obviously the SAGE advice, the economic advice, the socio-economic advice, the health advice. How do you, as Cabinet Secretary, ensure that your ultimate decision maker, Prime Minister and Cabinet or decision makers, get all those balancing factors and that sufficient weight is paid to all of them?
The key to that, my lady, is that it is cabinet, or at least a cabinet committee in which the key departments involved are represented, so that, for example, the impact of any decision on the provision of benefits, it's really important the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions is in the room at the table, and he or she will have been briefed by their department, not just on what they think about the main crisis, but on what the impact would be for them and how they're going to manage it. The same with the Treasury, obviously, and others. So the departmental structure means that ministers should be coming both as members of the cabinet, but advocates for the sector or sectors for which they are responsible, and that all of that input is brought into a collective decision. That's why collective decision making is generally better than decisions being made by a small cohort right at the very centre.
You've preempted what would be my final comment, not question, which is, but that does depend on the collective decision-making taking place.
Indeed.
Right. Sorry to have preempted some of our questions. Ms Mitchell, I think you're going next.
Lord Sedwill, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company for the Scottish COVID bereaved. I too wish to ask some questions about structures in place and making sure that the devolved administrations are properly engaged, which is what you've just reflected on. You've identified in your evidence so far that you sought to build strong relationships between the devolved administrations, both institutional and personal. And you indicated that you had conversations, for example, with Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister. What I would like to know is, was there then, or is there now, any formal structure or forum for you as Cabinet Secretary to liaise with the heads of the civil service of the devolved administrations?
Yes, there's at the governmental level, as you'll be very familiar, the Joint Ministerial Committee that brings them all together. The permanent secretaries for the Scottish, Welsh governments and Northern Ireland were all part of the wider permanent secretaries group. So it's known as Wednesday morning colleagues for reasons that are obvious. It just meets on a Wednesday. And I would always include them in, they were always, as of right, included in those meetings. It wasn't something I decided. I would also have informal get-togethers with the permanent secretaries of the devolved administrations, because there were particular, in smaller groups, just the 3 or 4 of us, because there were obviously particular issues of concern to them. So there was the overarching structure, which almost replicated cabinet plus DAs, and then informal meetings as well.
Well, I think you've probably preempted my next question, because my next question was about whether or not there were structures that you would like to have been in place during the first period, the most, I suppose, difficult and fast-moving period of COVID striking our shores. And I ask that in particular because we're aware that the joint ministerial committees were not being used.
No, they weren't, but the ministerial cobras, I think almost all, I think maybe even all in that phase, included devolved administration ministers, and the staff work behind that at official level will certainly have done so. So I think in that phase, the liaison with the devolved administrations, recognising that we were trying to move in lockstep in many areas which were devolved, but maintain coordination. I think that worked pretty well. And of course, they had their own chief medical officers and other, and they would meet as a group as well. So I think the connective tissue in that first phase was pretty strong at official level, at chief medical officer level. And as I said, the cobras were UK cobras.
Can I ask, did that happen by happenstance, or was there formal decision taken to form it that way?
I think it wouldn't have occurred to me to do it any other way. I don't recall anyone challenging it, certainly at that stage, and had they done so, I would have replied robustly that this was necessary.
If I can move on to another topic now, and that's in relation to communications between the devolved administration and the UK government. If I could have up on the screen inquiry number 000250229, and that's paragraph 147, page 39. What you say, and just that first paragraph was, I was conscious that, notwithstanding their divergent political agenda and differing styles of governance, the Prime Minister and the devolved administration First Ministers had reached much the same conclusion about the timing and nature of the first lockdown, its socio-economic mitigations and its release. Now, also you gave evidence this morning where you were being asked about when the decision for lockdown had been taken, and you were asked when that had been, and you responded by agreeing to a proposition that my learned friend had put to you and said, I presume that parallel processes were happening in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. There was a lot of communication between them. What I'm just wanting to check is it the communication between the devolved administrations themselves or communications between the devolved administration and the UK government?
Both. I would have imagined that they might be talking among the three about all of their relationships with the UK government, just given the obvious disparity. But there was certainly extensive and I think almost constant communication between officials in supporting ministers going into those meetings. When I said parallel processes, I think we were talking about the decisions the Prime Minister reached over some of those crucial days. What I meant by that was I assumed that, for example, the First Minister in Scotland would be with her team saying, right, what do we need to do? What's the situation in Scotland? London was further ahead than the rest of the country. She probably asked whether Scotland was a bit behind and did she have more time? I don't know, but that's the kind of thing I would have expected. And then it was brought together in the ministerial UK Cobras, which made the formal decisions and where the heads of all of the administrations were able to liaise. But there would have been intensive official contact beforehand.
Indeed, thank you. Were you aware of any representations from the Scottish Government to introduce a mandatory lockdown prior to the date of lockdown, the 23rd March 2020?
No, nor indeed from anyone else.
I've got no further questions, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. Mr Dale, I think you're going next. Don't worry about Mr Dale understands if you don't face him.
Oh.
You'll take your voice away from the microphone if you turn around.
Maybe I'll turn for the question, my lady, if that's okay.
Thank you, my lady. Lord Sedwill, I ask questions on behalf of FEMO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organizations. I have three short sets of questions. As you may know, there were press reports of a disproportionate death rate for COVID within Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities during the early stages of the pandemic. For example, The Guardian of April 10th reported that the first 10 doctors to die were from BAME background. So my first question is, how seriously was this issue taken at the Cabinet Office, if there was indeed awareness of this issue during the months of March and April 2020?
Thank you. I think going into the first lockdown, of course, it was country and society-wide. So in a sense, there was no discussion about whether there would be different kinds of measures taken for different groups on ethnic or indeed other grounds. It was certainly a feature in considering the mitigations for the lockdown. So as we were developing programmes to deal with the consequences of lockdown for different groups, we were certainly conscious of it. And as you say, their evidence did start to be made available quite early about differential impact. It was quite challenging to understand whether that evidence was telling us something about whether the virus had a purely ethnic differential impact that to do with ethnicity, or the degree to which that was overlain by social factors such as multi-generational households, denser living, and so on. But certainly in mitigating the lockdown and in considering measures to come out, we were conscious of those factors, and we were particularly conscious of the enforcement mechanisms. I recall in early April seeing some quite sobering data that suggested, I think, in London, for example, it was one of the ethnic minority communities, I can't remember exactly which, had a much higher incidence of enforcement from the Metropolitan Police than the population as a whole, and that was clearly a concern, and of course not for the first time had one heard that kind of concern about the relations between police and certain communities. So we were conscious of all of these things.
Very well. My second question, which I hope is not too much of a tutorial question, is what were the mechanisms, formal and informal, for issues affecting certain population groups being raised with senior decision makers?
In normal circumstances, for a major policy decision, there would have to be an equality impact assessment. And that is a standard process that involves consultation, interaction with community groups, academic research, etc., in order to make sure that a final decision by ministers on a policy matter properly understands and encompasses the potential impact on ethnic minorities, but also other protected groups, whether for gender, sexuality, whatever it might be. Going into the lockdown, of course, there was no time to be able to do any of that. And formal equality impact assessments are quite an involved process. So even as we were coming out, it wouldn't have been possible to do them in a timely way in the what one might call the full fat version of an equality impact assessment. But I certainly would have expected the policy work, and I believe this was the case, to take account of those factors as choices were being put to ministers about, for example, that release of that first lockdown, which would have covered social, economic, ethnic, and other factors, so that there was essentially an intelligent consideration of those.
Thank you. And my third and final question, which hopes for a clarification on a point of fact. How did the issue of disparate impacts on Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities reach senior decision makers, if it did?
It would be through the policy process. So one wouldn't have a parallel process for this. I mean, of course, there'd be informal feedback. I mentioned in answer to one of Mr. Keith's questions earlier, I think the role of cabinet ministers as constituency MPs as well as ministers, and that's a mechanism by which they can bring that they can bring that perspective. But the policy process itself is designed to include those factors, and therefore decisions coming to cabinet or the prime minister or ministers should encompass all of those factors. That's what a good policy process is designed to do.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Dale. Mr. Freeman's just there.
Good afternoon. I'm going to ask questions for 4 national disabled people's organisations. In July 2020, before leaving post, you gave a final valedictory lecture at Oxford University, and it's exhibited at paragraph 150 of your statement, in which you endorsed the need to build back better, especially given COVID's adverse effect on what you called the poorest and most vulnerable in society. I could see you nodding, so you recall. On that, we want to ask you firstly about consultation with groups from outside government, and secondly about the way that government is internally organised when it comes to considering inequalities. So first on outside consultation. There's a report from the Institute for Government that was in your evidence pack, and it's titled Decision Making in Crisis First Responses to the Coronavirus Pandemic. It's up there, and can we go to page 50, please? I want to look at the top paragraph first, and the recommendation as to bringing representatives of those affected by a decision into the room compensates for imperfect information. It is inevitable in a crisis that decision-making is centralised to some degree, as ministers want to act quickly and take control, but bringing non-government partners inside the tent helps compensate for the uncertainty created by imperfect information in a crisis, as well as building trust and creating allies to explain and defend policies. And then just down into the next paragraph, examples are then given as to those who would benefit from, in its words, being brought into the tent, and their things and organisations like business groups and unions with regard to decisions. That creates a benefit of knowing about ground intelligence and goodwill and trust. So, firstly, do you agree with that recommendation? And as you said in your own final lecture, in particular, that government should work much more to, I'm going to use your words, co-design its policies with those affected by them?
The short answer is yes. And I think the IFG report sets it out very well. We didn't touch on it in detail in my earlier evidence, but as we were planning the release from the first lockdown, a major part of that was engagement. Sorry, I won't look around from the microphone. Was engagement with businesses and other representative groups to create the Safer Workplaces programme. That was one of those 36 programmes I referred to. And of course, that should, as I said earlier to the earlier question, in any good policy process, involve engagement with other representative groups, including, of course, of different, and particularly in these circumstances, different groups of the most vulnerable in society. But co-design, absolutely, I believe better policy results from that. And
you've effectively preempted my second question, but just to make clear to my lady, because in a sense, the reference to business groups and unions might be described as old-style corporatist references. I mean, all policies presumably speak to business groups and unions. But I think you've made a face. Maybe they don't enough. That's another set of questions. But I think you're making clear, are you not, that especially in what we are looking at in this inquiry, it is now high time to develop those kind of enhanced approaches and to consultation and engagement with representatives from civil society social groups such as disabled peoples and of course others that are represented in this inquiry. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I would hope with modern technology it is easier perhaps to do that in a more dynamic way than perhaps would have been through traditional methods, but the fundamental point is one I agree with.
Can I then turn to internal government, I'm going to say again structures, back to that, but a more particular question. The inquiry is aware of how the machinery of government divides responsibilities for categories of inequality across a range of ministerial portfolios with no dedicated Department of State. So, for instance, we're just about to hear from Mr. Tomlinson, the previous Minister for Disabled People, who was located in a junior position in the Department of Work and Pensions, with no direct leadership of the Cabinet Disability Unit, and other core participants who, for instance, act for children, race and ethnic minorities, and violence against women and girls can point to variants of the same problem. In terms of building back better, would the future solution lie in the creation of an equality department with a Secretary of State, or would you suggest some other structure and change of approach?
I think I would leave the decisions on Departments of State for governments to take. I think it is, they reflect the priorities and the way that a Prime Minister wishes to organise government, the manifesto on which they're elected. And I think I shouldn't presume to second guess that, because that would be something that would be, as I say, subject to a manifesto and an election. The reason for having ministers not necessarily co-located in a department with, for example, the units, and you mentioned the disabled unit, is because the responsibility moves between ministers regrettably too quickly, but that's been a feature of our system recently. And what we didn't want to do was move departmental units around. And so there was a decision taken some years ago to essentially create some stability in the units responsible for these various issues, whilst allowing Prime Ministers to appoint a Minister for the Disabled, a Minister for Women, a Minister for other groups, and support them wherever they might be located. Again, it's a judgment call. One can make a case for doing it differently. There's clearly a case, as you suggest, for a Department of Equality, but I'm afraid I will punt that one into the political level of decision making because it must reflect the priorities of an incoming government.
Last question on that. If that's your stance, and we understand why you would take that stance, is it fair to say that the nature of the system as it was in COVID did pose some challenges for holistic views, for instance, to those who were socially vulnerable and the likes of the matters that we raised in the first set of questions?
Undoubtedly it posed challenges, but I think if you look at the material exhibited alongside my witness statement, I think every cabinet discussion, for example, of COVID referenced the impact on vulnerable groups. And we weren't just thinking about the medically vulnerable to COVID itself. Actually, the reason I brought Simon Case in, the first job I asked him to do when he came in from the royal household, was to set up a programme of support for the groups we call essentially the socially vulnerable. In other words, not those who are medically vulnerable to COVID, but who were socially vulnerable to the impact of lockdown. And we wanted to make sure we had programmes in place to support them as well. So I think it ran through the work we were doing. But of course, it'll be for Milady to judge. I think maybe in the course of a later module about its effectiveness. But certainly there was an attempt throughout, at least my period, that first lockdown, etc., to ensure we were considering and supporting the most vulnerable groups in society.
So just so we can be clear, though, your concerted work on that started with Simon Case coming in to partner on that?
No, that was when he came in to essentially give some additional heft to a programme we'd already begun. We set up, I think almost in parallel, programmes. We discussed the shielding programme earlier, but programmes to provide necessities, etc., to the medically vulnerable who needed a particularly stringent form of lockdown, quarantine, in effect quarantine. But we also recognise there were many people with complex needs, for whom lockdown generally would be challenging, and we set up a separate programme for that. Simon took that on, but it predated him.
Thank you, Milady.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. That completes the questions.
It does.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Sedwill. Thank you very much for staying for as long as you have and for your patience. I hope we haven't trespassed upon it too much.
Thank you, Milady.
Right, we need to break now. I shall return at 20 past.